welcome everyone to another episode of Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster. With me, as always, is my co-host, Jared Kozel. How are you doing, Jared?
Excellent. We're going to talk about one of my all-time favorite movies, so I couldn't be better.
Yeah, and today is sort of official, unofficial, but it's the start of a new series called Revisited, which was sort of inevitable because as much as I have a long, long list of movies that I would like to talk about, there's undoubtedly favorites that you have, um, and of course, those were the first ones that I got to when I started this channel, and so it's just natural that, given a certain amount of time, I would want to work my way back around to those, and especially now, Jared, with you having come on as co-host. A lot of these you didn't get to discuss with me, so it gives the perfect excuse to dive back into them. And so we decided for our first one of these that we're going to be talking about Pan's Labyrinth, which is a 2006 Guillermo del Toro film. To my mind, it is, whatever praise you want to heap upon it, one of the greatest fantasy films of all time, one of the greatest films, period, of all time. Without a doubt, my favorite film of the year it came out, which is funny because last week we talked about my favorite film of the year after, which was Atonement, and now we're going back a year to Pan's Labyrinth. And revisiting this, I was really struck by how powerful it still is after all these years, and how it sort of brought me back to that time in my life, which I guess, your favorite movies often do. Uh, and it just reminded me of how exciting it was to actually, I got to see this in the cinema, and there was just something so magical about that, especially in the years after Lord of the Rings had come out, and you were really starting to see the beginning of a new frontier almost with fantasy filmmaking. And not that this is, the same kind of film as Lord of the Rings, but it did feel like that same kind of genius, you know, just auteur filmmaking, that just, it immediately made Guillermo del Toro one of my all-time favorite directors. So yeah, I've been enchanted with this movie just from day one. And yeah, and real quick, before I shoot it over to you, Jared, I want to say hi to a couple of people, starting with the wonderful AR, who the last time I discussed this movie on the channel, AR, you were a co-host with me, and we had, at least I think you were my co-host. You were on the stream in any case. I don't remember the exact timeline of all that, but I know that you were on the discussion with me. Stev was on with us, and so was Cecilia from over at Geek Sterelia. And we had a wonderful discussion. And if any of you want to check that discussion out, I did put it in the description of the video. So that way you can get double the Pan's Labyrinth content. And yeah, so hello to AR, hello to Stephanie, to Lady Starfall. Great to see you guys. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I do buy a lot of movies on Blu-ray, but but this was, I actually remember this came out just before Blu-ray really started to hit, and I had got it on DVD, but I had at that time bought a high definition TV, and DVDs were no longer as pristine looking on HD sets as they had been on previous sets. So I remember I was waiting for the Blu-ray to come out, and I've bought it several times since then. But yeah, I'll toss it over to Jared. How did you come to the movie, and tell us about you said that this is pretty much, if you remove like the normal go-to choices like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and all that, you said this is right up at the top of your list. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, when you think about when you encountered your favorite movie, everyone has a different story correlated to the experience and the time in their life they encountered it. And for the fact that this is one of my all-time favorite movies, though my first encounter with it was not where you would have expected. I did not see it in the cinema. I did not even rent it at home. I saw this in my freshman year of college during my freshman year Spanish course when everyone needed to take a foreign language credit, and I had taken Spanish in high school, so I was continuing that in college. And, one of the ways that they kind of helped ease us into, being able to appreciate language in its spoken form as opposed to just studying it from a textbook was they would treat us to a movie every week. And that's how I watched a number of Spanish classics, including a lot of Pedro Almodovar films like Volver. But one week on a random Friday, my class, convened and they put this movie on. And for most of the class, it was just, okay, this is our movie. This is our time to perhaps not pay as close of attention. We're gonna, just kind of relax because it's a Friday before we hit the weekend. And that was kind of my mindset when I started at first. I had heard of this movie before I had seen it. I had heard that it was incredibly acclaimed, that it had been up for Oscars the previous years. This was 2007. And so but I wasn't necessarily expecting, a special experience. But that is what I got, because from the moment this movie started, in a brightly lit classroom surrounded by people who were just there to get a language credit, with a teacher who was, kind of sitting in the back, chilling on her phone. This movie started and I was wrapped, because it just seized my attention from the opening frame, from the opening narration, and I was utterly entranced by it. And as the story unfolded, I had lost track of everything else that was happening. I just was so enraptured with the story. And then we got to the hour mark and the class ended and they turned the movie off in the middle. And I was very unhappy because I wanted to continue watching this.
You're bringing me back to my experience of seeing Amadeus for the first time in my music class. And we got to right in the middle of Mozart's funeral at the end of the movie. And it was Friday, and the bell rang, and the TV went off, and everybody left. And I was like, what the hell are you doing to me? So I rented it.
Yeah.
And, that very night. But yeah, I definitely know the feeling.
Yeah. And I mean, like that, it's a common experience for a lot of people that back in the day, this was how teachers, even in college, would sometimes get through the class where they would just put a movie on and let the students fend for themselves. But this movie, I was, completely captured by the story, even though it was a Spanish, language movie, and that we were ostensibly watching it to practice our Spanish skills. I almost didn't even register the fact that it was in Spanish because the story was just that captivating. And, reading the subtitles didn't like create a barrier to entry for me at all. And they stopped the movie right before Ofelia goes in to have her confrontation with the Pale Man, which is, you know, one hell of a cliffhanger, even though if I didn't know exactly what was coming at that time. And so we left the classroom. I went back to my dorm room, and I immediately was like, I got to figure out how to watch the rest of this movie. I'm not waiting for class next week. We're going to do this. So I went out, I found it, I started it from the beginning, and that experience, sitting alone in my dorm room, again, still not the most ideal viewing experience for a movie like this, watching it on my computer screen, didn't matter. It had me by the heart and the soul, and I was just thrilled by it and emotionally moved by it and devastated by it. And when I finished watching it on my tiny computer screen in my brightly lit dorm room, it didn't matter that I hadn't seen it in the cinema. I was like, that is one of the best movies I've ever seen in my entire life. And my feelings have not changed. If anything, they've only gotten stronger. And that, I say all that just as an amusing anecdote, but just to say that when you encounter a story that means something to you and means this much to you for reasons that I'm sure we'll go into in detail, it doesn't matter how you see it. It doesn't matter if it's not like the ideal moment. Sometimes it just, the story finds you, and it finds you where you needed to be found. And for me, that is this movie, and it is one of still my favorite movie experiences ever. I've now seen it countless times since, in better viewing conditions, because this is a gorgeous movie that deserves the best possible screen and the best possible conditions and the best possible sound system. But the story is the thing, and the themes and the power of the ideas behind it. It is a term that oftentimes gets thrown around, perhaps liberally by some, too sparingly by others. It's a personal term that only you can define whatever objective criteria people want to put out about it. To me, this movie is a masterpiece, and this movie is perfect.
Yeah. You can say that about your experience, you know, how you saw it, but I'm still going to lord it over you that I got to see this in the cinema with
And
the darker
I'm
lights.
jealous of you, but doesn't matter.
And what I love most of all, and really for me, only the Criterion Collection version of the movie really comes close to replicating the look of the film. Yeah, as it was in theater, because when it was initially released on DVD and Blu-ray, I think the studio, like, you know, made the blacks like bolder, you know, ramped up the colors a certain way, removed all the film grain from it. And my distinct memory of seeing it in the theater was that the black levels were a bit, you know, like, you know, not deep, but like you could see, like, not quite grayish, but, you know, but elevated. And there was a lot of film grain, uh, and it just felt like it was almost like, as beautiful as the film was, there was almost this rough texture to it. Um, and the Criterion version is kind of the only version that has sort of come close to replicating that. Um, Thankfully, the 4K Blu-ray, even though it's a bit, like, color wise and brightness wise, it's a bit closer to the original DVD. It's at least that has like the full film grain, you know, in the movie, because you don't want to rob this movie of any of its texture. And it's such a beautiful film. And so I just remember seeing it in the theater like that. I went with my mom, of course, because her and I were movie buddies. And I just remember being like, this is so beautiful, and it's so, like, heart-achingly, like, tragic, but yet uplifting, and just, there's a mastery of the filmmaking that, you know, and I had liked some Guillermo del Toro movies that I'd seen prior. I had seen the first Hellboy film, which since I saw this movie afterwards, I came to love that movie more and more and more, and now it's one of my favorite like comic book films of all time. But this was the film that really got my attention, and because it felt like this was Guillermo del Toro being his true self, because all the stuff I had seen from him was his Hollywood work, and this was like really embracing, you know, who he was, and it was the sort of bravado filmmaking that, you know, that you feel like you only get to see once, you know, every once in a great while. And it that was for me was the similarity to Lord of the Rings, the fact that there were fantasy elements also, but it felt like the same kind of audacious, you know, breathtaking filmmaking that sort of transcended the whatever genre, you know, it might appear to be. And this movie is a mixture of genres to be sure. um and yeah, it's just, and it does remind me, unfortunately, of how excited I was when The Hobbit was going to be a collaboration between Peter Jackson and Guillermo del Toro, and I will forever be sad that we didn't get to see that version of The Hobbit. But one can dream, you know. In There's an alternate universe out there where that film got to be a reality. But uh, but yeah, it's just one of the greatest pieces of cinema uh, ever created, and I am just always so under its spell each time I go back to watch it.
It is a singular achievement. It is a movie that is obviously incredibly personal to the filmmaker who made it, Guillermo del Toro. It is a movie that only he could have made. And, you know, Guillermo del Toro has a very distinct visual style and subject matter that he likes to visit. He is very fascinated by his own admission with the idea of monsters, and what they mean in our collective consciousness and the thematic power behind them, and the ideas of fairy tales and fantasy. And he is not ashamed of those influences. Sometimes filmmakers kind of feel that these ideas are quote unquote immature or childish, and if even if they are going to delve into those subjects, they feel the need to either disguise it a bit or to, you know, try to play with convention. So they're like, oh, it's this type of story, it's a monster story, but it's adult, you know, it's meant to be for on a higher level. And this movie is very much in, you know, a fairy tale for adults in that way, but it is the essence of a fairy tale in its construction and its intention, and the fact that its subject matter is incredibly dark does not take away from what it is, which is ultimately a very simple story by Guillermo del Toro's own, you know, mission. When he talks about the construction of this story, he, you know, he's very honest about the fact that it's not like the most complicated narrative in the world, even though it has layers upon layers upon layers of, you know, thematic and narrative power. But ultimately, it is a fairy tale. It is a fantasy story. It is a monster story, but it is also so much more than that, because it is a story where Guillermo del Toro knew that the intersection of these stories between what fantasy and real world, this is why we tell these stories. We tell these stories to help make sense of the inexplicable. His fascination with monsters is very much, you know, his fascination with the idea of human beings creating monsters in their popular culture to deal with ideas that they struggle with and can't explain, to deal with horror, to deal with sadness, to deal with grief. and to kind of give those ideas a visual representation that becomes a bit easier to reckon with than just the simple idea of the nebulous concept itself. And he is better at that than pretty much any filmmaker I've ever seen, because this is the quintessential example of how to deal with that kind of storytelling. And the fact that it also deals with incredibly significant real world, ideas and history, like the time period when this movie is set is incredibly important. And to combine that with that, like, masterful visual craftsmanship, you have a story that is just completely engrossing and works on every conceivable level.
Yeah. Real quick. Okay, we'll see you in a bit, Stephanie. Thank you for being here whenever you can. We appreciate it. Also, I wanted to say hi, if they're still here, to the one and only Tinkerbell. Thank you for stopping in and saying hi. We appreciate it. And also, I do want to say it's funny. I've lived with that information for so long, like it's almost part of my own story. I know it so well, but it occurs to me that maybe at this point, either some people have forgotten or maybe some people never knew. But at one point, Guillermo del Toro was set to direct 2 films as an adaptation of The Hobbit. This was before Peter Jackson agreed to direct the films, and then eventually got turned into a trilogy. But the problem was there were so many legal hurdles to get The Hobbit going that Del Toro stayed on the project for as long as he could, and then left, because he is his own filmmaker, and he had other things that he wanted to do. As heartbroken as I know he was that he didn't get to do The Hobbit, but I maintain that whatever your thoughts are on the films that we eventually did get, I don't think anyone could argue that Guillermo del Toro directed Hobbit would have been really interesting and very, very different. But like I said, we can all dream about what that might have been, and I don't have any regrets in terms of the films that we have gotten from Del Toro, because he continues to reward us with his genius. As a matter of fact, now I find myself curious about what his next project is, because I'm always very excited for the next one of his films, but we'll focus on the film that we're talking about for now. That intersection between reality and fantasy, and the fact that both elements are treated with the same amount of, for lack of a better term, realism. That the fascists and the Pale Man are just as terrifying, and what I remarked upon when I was watching it today was all the scenes that are showing the quote unquote reality. And we're going to talk about like what we view as reality versus fantasy in this, because in my opinion, and I know people have their own takes on the film, but the film has always been beautifully ambiguous to me. And that's part of its power. But if you look at the quote unquote reality parts of the movie, with the war and, the freedom fighters against the fascists, it's so rare to see a movie that's about that type of subject matter to look as beautiful as this film does. Like, we're so used to like sepia toned, dirty and grimy, and not to say that there isn't dirt and grime in a lot of the stuff that we see in this film, but the look of the film is so different from what you imagine war films of the past 20, 30 years to look like. And I love that, because it matches, like, it both has a unique look apart from the fantasy stuff, but yet it's also of the same, you know, it feels of the same film. It's not like, oh, well, there's this clear delineation, where, one part of this film looks like Saving Private Ryan and the other part looks like Lord of the Rings. No, it's very beautifully, all of one piece. And this film rightfully won Best Cinematography that year at the Oscars. So if nothing else, it's one of the most beautiful films ever made. But it has so much more than that as well.
Yeah, that cinematography win for Guillermo Navarro is one of my all-time favorite Oscar wins in any category. All three of this movie's wins, honestly, for makeup and for original score as well. But it is a movie that the craftsmanship, is one of the reasons it is so great. But the craftsmanship is in service to the story. And the fact that this movie is like ultimately about the blend between the fantastical and the real world means that those two elements, while they are ultimately distinct, they feel like they're part of the same, canvas that this artist is painting on. And one of the things that has kind of struck me as I've rewatched this movie over the years is that even though for most people I would say that the fantastical elements are probably one of the first things that you'll think about when it comes to this movie. You'll think about the faun, you'll think about the pale man, you'll think about, the kind of the underworld and the kind of the beautiful imagery that Ofelia finds during her quest to complete these three tasks. But the movie is actually much more grounded in the real world. Like the fantastical elements are not as big of an part of it in terms of just sheer screen time as you would think. But they're so well integrated and they echo the power of and the themes that are present from the real world storyline and reflect them back and then are deepened by them in turn, that the entire movie feels like it's taking place on that kind of fairy tale plane, and some of that is kind of just the very deliberate choices that Guillermo del Toro made in his setting of the story. This movie is very intimate in its setting. It basically takes place all at one farmhouse, mill house set in the deep woods with the labyrinth nearby. And and while it ventures into kind of the mystical realms, it is very confined to this one place, like Ofelia herself is confined. And for some, that might feel somewhat limiting. This is not like the Lord of the Rings in terms of the grandeur of epic scale of like creating an entire world, but the entire world is present in this very small space. And so the depth that you feel is just like ravishing because you just feel like you can sink into it and get lost in it, even if you're really just stuck at this very specific place in time. And I just find that to be such a fascinating contrast. It's the kind of thing where it's difficult to pull off, because if you're going to spend the entire movie in basically the same location, you have to find ways to keep making that location feel new and interesting. And Del Toro does that by indulging in the fantasy, but he also does it by making it feel incredibly lived in and real. And every character you encounter, from our main players like Ofelia and Captain Vidal and Mercedes, all the way down to the smallest, bit parts of like the villagers who come in and out of the story, they all feel like they belong here, like they live here, like this is their life. And so it feels very much like a snapshot in time. And when you add in the fact that there's this entire other underworld that's layered either on top of it or below it, however you want to frame it, that's not visible to the naked eye except to maybe Ophelia's eye. It just makes it feel that much more rich and real. And I just want to sink into it every time I watch it.
Yeah. Real quick, I'll just touch on the Hobbit thing one more time because Lady Starfall brought it up. He's actually credited as writer on all three films, and the reason for that being that he did write screenplays for the films, but when Peter Jackson took over as director, naturally they basically did a page one rewrite. And started from scratch, which is why the production on those films was hellish, to say the least. He didn't. Peter Jackson did not have the time that he had on the Lord of the Rings, but the fact that so much of the foundation had been laid by the work that Guillermo del Toro had done, that they still gave him credit for writing, which I was very happy about. And I'd really love to, I'm hoping one day there will be a retrospective documentary or maybe a book or something that'll dive into like maybe what elements from his screenplay are the ones that most prominently survived in later drafts. That would be very interesting. But we'll have to see if we get that one day.
Maybe by the time we talk about The Hobbit on this channel, we'll have something like that.
Yeah. Well, there was a beautiful book that came out a number of years ago called, I think it was Imagine This, the making of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was, it touched a little bit on The Hobbit, but only superficially. It was mostly about the production of the Lord of the Rings. And if any of you haven't read that, it's a beautiful book, and it really took me back to when I was a teenager, following the production of those films. It was a great bit of nostalgia, and in addition to being really well written. So I hope dearly that we get something like that for the Hobbit films one day. But anyway, going back to Pan's Labyrinth, it's just the way that all the different elements are balanced, and that's why like it's really important that even though there's a stark contrast between sort of the dark the dark reality of all the storyline with the war and all that, balanced with what Ophelia is going through with the fantasy elements. It's You can't have those feeling too different. In order for this movie to work, they have to operate on somewhat of the same plane of existence, for lack of a better term, and stylistically they have to feel like it goes together, and that's what makes this film as amazing as it is, because I don't think it would work if you felt like those two sides of the story were too different. And like I said, that's I think what visually makes this film so unique, and also just and it's also what makes the end of the story beautiful in its own unique way, where it's not just like, it's not as simple as, oh, she was imagining all this, and the cruel dark reality is what we're seeing over here. And that's a valid interpretation, but I think what the film actually has going on is a lot more complex, and I think it's stronger for that.
Yeah. No, I would agree. And well, everyone, as you alluded to, will have their own interpretation as to how much of this is real. I personally lean much more toward the camp that this is real, this is happening in because that's the way that the movie treats it. This movie, by its very nature, does not treat what is happening as Ophelia essentially imagining these things. Now,
It gives you it gives you room to interpret it that way.
Yes.
If you choose, but
yes.
I feel it also gives you just as much, to interpret it the other way if you want. And that for me is where the power really is. It's why I said it's beautifully ambiguous. And of course, then when I ask myself, what do I think Guillermo del Toro probably thinks about this? That's why I've never been able to solidly land on the world is cold and cruel and nothing that Ophelia saw was real, because I'm like, well, there's no way Del Toro believes that, because I know the kind of both the kind of filmmaker he is and the kind of person that he is based on every word I've ever heard him speak. And so that's why, like, and I don't necessarily even lean one way or the other. It's like I said, it's in somewhere in the middle where you're allowed to sort of say, well, this beat would seem to indicate this, but that beat indicates this, and sort of just be happy in that middle ground of recognizing that the world is a cruel, dark place, but also that there is more than what some people would be able to allow themselves to see, and I love that line at the very last bit of narration, that the princess left behind traces of her time here for those who know where to look. And for me, that's what is being said, is that it's real, but only if you're looking for it.
Yeah,
and if you're not, then
that is the interpretation that I hold to. I hold to the idea that this movie is real because the experiences that Ophelia is going through, all the emotions that she is feeling, the hardships and the pain and the questions that she is wrestling with are very real. And that is like unambiguous. What is more ambiguous is the nature of the fantastical creatures themselves. But where I come down is the idea that this movie would be pitched differently if we were treating this very much as this is a dream, this is a coping strategy, this is this is someone going insane. That's not the way that the movie presents these things. The movie presents these fantastical elements as real. Does that mean they actually are real? That I am more open to the question of the viewer's interpretation. But, the unfortunate nature of sometimes when people get into what they call dream logic and the idea that like what we're seeing on screen isn't actually happening, that gives them permission to discount that part of the story. Because for some viewers, it is an unfortunate fact that if something is not grounded in reality, then they don't engage with it on the same level. And
it's always been very like, and I get where that comes from, but then I'm always like, you get that you're engaging in the very act of like imagining just by sitting down and watching a film. What's happening is not real any way you slice it. So why are you then so bound by the rules of normal reality and like how you're evaluating the course of events? It's the same issue that I take with, and I'm not saying people can't feel this way. Everybody's it's, everybody has their own experiences and the way they view things. But I'm always struck by when people say they can't get into musicals, particularly movie musicals, because it's so unrealistic. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, this is all unrealistic. It's people on a screen playing make believe. But so I've never been one to, like, just because, yeah, if I saw these events unfolding in reality, I'd say, okay, I'll judge it that way, but it's because I'm watching a film and because I'm allowing myself to be open to something that goes beyond sort of normal, traditional, real world, realism. I don't have a better word, but it's, yeah, it's one of those things that I feel like I'm more open to that than a lot of people are, which is not to disparage, anybody else who views things, but yeah, so it's not a simple matter of, well, what's more realistic, but it's what is the story communicating to me, and what am I supposed to take from this?
Yeah. And the movie itself reckons with that very question, which is one of the reasons that I feel as strongly about it as I do. Because I don't want to, divert our discussion to talking about the way that people engage with stories. Everyone engage with the stories differently, and everyone has different value judgments. The two of us are very much in love with a lot of fantasy stories and ideas, because we feel, much as J.R.R. Tolkien felt, that like fairy stories are a way for us to get something from these stories that we might not be able to get from a story that's grounded in pure, hard reality without that level of imagination. But within the movie itself, it asked that same question, and Guillermo del Toro's other films, just to step back for 1 second, this is the only movie where he even really makes that a question. Pretty much all of his other movies, it's like, no, the monsters are real, the magic is real, the ghosts are real, and if you can't reckon with that, this may not be the movie for you. This movie is much more inviting, but it also challenges those same beliefs within the context of the story itself, because our protagonist, Ofelia, is a young girl, maybe like 11, 12 years old, who is very much in love with stories, and fairy stories in particular. And she's held on to them, perhaps past the age where some of the people in her life, like her mother, definitely her stepfather, feel that she should. And so they're constantly trying to, cause her to set those things aside. And they have different motivations for doing so. But if we look at, for instance, her mother, who is obviously has her best interests at heart in this matter, she wants Ofelia to set aside this fantastical idea and these stories, because she wants to prepare her for the harshness of what she sees as real life. She has that speech to her right before her unfortunate, death, that where she talks to Ofelia about, these fairy stories that she's so obsessed with, and she's like, life isn't like these stories. The world is a cruel place, and you will learn that, even if it hurts. And that's right before she, effectively tosses the mandrake into the fire, and that precipitates the events that lead to her own death. And there's a real world explanation for that. But that is very much the shattering of one of the last bastions of Ophelia's innocence, losing her mother in that way. And it's something that could have very much broken her belief in these fantastical ideas, or caused her to retreat more deeply into it. And in this movie, you don't have to make that choice, because, as I have expressed my belief from the way the story is presented, these elements are real. They're part of the unseen world, and you can only see them as the ending of the movie says, if you know where to look. And Ofelia knows where to look, both because she's more open to it and also because she needs that story as part of her, a way to deal and cope with reality. And the way that these elements present themselves to her are echoed in her real life, but also they provide a level of escape and meaning and understanding for her that means that she is able to do things that she might not otherwise be able to do. She's able to survive for as long as she does. Ultimately, she does not survive. The world is a cruel place and it comes at the cost of her life. But her life and the way that she lived it had meaning because she gave it meaning. And ultimately, her choices are the most important thing. And her motivations in making those choices are influenced by what she believes. And that's why they have power, even if other people can't see that same unseen world.
Yeah, and let's operate for a moment under the conclusion that she does imagine everything that we see, because like I said, just because I'm of a certain mind, that analysis of the film is perfectly valid, and one that a lot of people have about the movie, that she imagines everything, and that the world around her is cold and dark, and yeah, at the end of the movie she dies. But what is so beautiful about what she goes through, and and this is going back to talking about that connection to Tolkien, and going back to that of fantasy storytelling, fairy stories as an escape. And why wouldn't you want to? The people telling you not to escape are usually jailers, to paraphrase him. And and what's so great about what she does go through in the story is that without those stories and and the experience that she goes through in the fantasy world, is that yes, ultimately she does die, but her innocence is never broken throughout the film. She does go through the tragedy of losing her mother, but even in the face of that, she perseveres, and all the way to where um to escape this horrific world, she won't even shed a drop or two of blood of her baby brother. You know, the fact that she holds on to so much of herself when surrounded with such darkness is a testament to the power of believing in in fairy stories, and uh, and so, and I love that as a lesson to be learned from this movie. Okay, for us out here in the real world, don't actually believe that there's a faun who's going to whisk you away to a lost kingdom, but appreciate the value that these stories hold, because they can help you get through a lot of the darkness of the real world, and and they can help you deal with things that you can't necessarily process in uh, you know because it's too much. And so even drawing that, uh you know going with that interpretation of the film, I think it's still a very hopeful interpretation, because it allows this innocent young girl to, yes, she dies, but in a way she may have survived better than those who are scarred by the horrors of that conflict. And yeah, and I just think that's a really beautiful, uh, that's a beautiful story to be told. And it's why, like, it's one of the reasons why I love the ending of the movie so much, is because I am alternatively like lit up with joy and also filled with such heart-aching sadness. Um, so it's the dichotomy of that I think is so amazing in this film.
Yeah, no, it is an incredibly emotional film with one of the most beautiful and devastating endings that I've ever seen. It makes me cry every time I watch it, including today when I just watched it.
Yeah, me too.
Um, and the reason that it holds that power is because it is incredibly tragic that this young girl's life was cut short in this fashion, and that she had to pay this cost because she shouldn't have had to. You know, the circumstances in which she found herself were not her fault, and she, you know, but she made the choice that she would not allow others to suffer, you know, in her place. You know, if we were thinking about the idea that this is a pure, you know, like something that's happening in reality, and which again I subscribe to, but you know, the choice that she makes at the end not to, you know, sacrifice her brother and to give up her rights and inheritance to this mystical underground kingdom. You know, you can think about for a moment what the story would have been had she made that choice, what kind of story it would have been if she was like, this world is brutal and miserable and terrible, and I've suffered, you know, immeasurably, and I have the opportunity to escape. And if this is the cost, you know, had she been willing to pay that, would that have, you know, there are sometimes cautionary tales where you make that sacrifice and then it's like that is the thing that costs you. You know, she doesn't. You know, this is very much in keeping with ideas of traditional ideas of self-sacrifice. You know, she will not make someone else pay that cost, even if it means she does not get what she has so desperately craved throughout the entire movie. And she makes that choice because she is fundamentally, you know, a good person, an innocent in the sense that everything that she has done up to this point has not been something that has corrupted her spirit. You know, she has perhaps lost some of the illusions that she once may have held on to, but she still believes in the like the power of what is good and right within the world, and she will not betray that even in her final moments. And that is an incredibly powerful idea. And
Yeah.
of course, that means that, you know, she ultimately pays the cost in this brutal and harsh world because her Captain Vidal is someone who does not understand these things. And he very much sees her as someone to be disposed of, and so he does. And had the movie, you know, kind of just reckoned with the idea that this young girl made this choice and paid for it, and she's, you know, now gonna be lost to the world forever, that would have been an incredibly bleak ending. And for as dark and as tragic and as, you know, heart-wrenching as this movie is, I actually don't find this ending to be bleak. I find it to be hopeful and reaffirming because, again, the choice matters. Her choice mattered, you know, and her life mattered. And, you know, and the fact that, like, even though I cry and my heart shatters every time I see, you know, her lying there on the ground with the blood, you know, running down her face and down her hand, and Mercedes, oh God, Mercedes, like the noise, the cry that she makes when she realizes Ophelia is gone, like I'm getting choked up just thinking about it right now. But this is the choice that Ophelia had to make. And it's all the more powerful that we, saw her do it without knowing if she would get that reward that she ultimately gets.
Just going to stop and say, welcome, Pat Mule. A long time no see. It's great to see you. I think the last time you and I spoke, at least in person, was I was on, I think it was an Andor stream with you. And yeah, we had a great time. Thank you for being here. But yeah, it's... And funny thing, I think it really depends on also where you're at in your life in terms of what you respond to. I remember when I was younger seeing this numerous times, but certainly when I saw it in theaters, I was sobbing over Ophelia's death, and maybe it's because now I'm in a place where I've been dealing with death, and I can't quite handle, focusing on that in my storytelling. So what I actually teared up about on my viewing today was when she's in the kingdom and she's been reunited with her family, and the line from her mother, your father has been waiting for you for oh so long. And that destroyed me today. And I think very much, it's no wonder, just because of everything that's been going on. And I'm sure that subconsciously when I was watching, I was thinking of, being reunited with my mother. And so it's just interesting how when you're at different points in your life and you've had different experiences, what it is that you respond to, and those can. It's funny that I was more innocent back then, and I cried at the darkness of death, and now I'm actually gone through that experience of dealing with the loss of someone I love, but what gets me is the hope and the joy of seeing them again. So yeah, so that was quite the experience I had today watching it. But it shows that I still love crying at movies regardless, because it is a very cathartic experience.
Yeah. No, and when you think about like what, the essay that we always return to, Tolkien's essay on fairy stories and like the virtues of what they give us, when he talks about recovery, escape, and consolation or eucatastrophe, like this movie very much lives all three of those elements, and especially the final one, consolation, the idea of, reconciling with, something that was lost, and the joys of the happy ending, because ultimately where Ophelia finds herself in this, mystical realm, reunited with her father, with her mother, and the reaffirmation that she made the right choice. One of the things I find so powerful about that sequence is, she sees her father, she sees her mother, and her father like reaffirms that, you chose to, spill your own blood instead of the blood of the innocent. This, this was the final task and the most important. And then the faun, who has been her guide throughout this entire process, despite being a benevolent figure, and he emerges from behind the pillar and he says, "And you chose well, Altessa, Your Highness." And that always sends chills down my spine, because she did, even if this is, under the other interpretation, just her constructing this fantasy in her dying moments, which I don't believe is the case again. But even if it is, that message is true. She chose well. by choosing not to spill the blood of an innocent, to not obey without questioning. Another theme that I really want to talk about this movie is the idea of obedience and disobedience, and what it can lead you to. And the very fact that Ofelia, despite being warned by the faun earlier that you must obey me, chooses to disobey him, and then ultimately is rewarded for it. But even if she hadn't been, she would have chosen to disobey him anyway. That is so important, because one of the most powerful lines in the movie that we'll revisit when we talk about these characters, but the line that the doctor has to Vidal, to obey just like that, without questioning for the sake of obeying, is something only men like you can do. And that is not who Ofelia is. It never was, and it never will be, because she had the righteous moral compass in her, instilled by these values that led her on down the true path.
Before we stop for a mid-roll, we addressed this kind of a little bit earlier when you were talking about the fact that you didn't even notice that it was in a different language when you saw it the first time. For me, I'm not one of those people who has any issue with subtitles. For me, it's like I only really notice them for about the first 30 seconds of whatever I'm watching, and then it's sort of just subconscious, where then for the rest of the movie, I'm not quite hearing it in English, but I just forget that I'm watching something in a different language, and my eyes are just moving so quickly from subtitle to screen that it's just, it becomes something that I'm not even thinking about. So for me, it was fine. I will say, and this is a bit of a digression, but I'm angry at my second year Spanish teacher, and that's being generous, calling her a Spanish teacher, because the first year went well, but then that teacher left for some reason. In my second year of Spanish, they stuck some teacher in there who did not even know Spanish. And let's just say that the other students in the class were able to strong arm her into essentially letting them cheat on every single test. She should have been let go. And so whatever progress I made that first year was utterly destroyed by the second year. I would love to be able to watch this film without subtitles. Oh my God, that would be great. But I can't. But it's okay, because I still, like I said, I don't tend to think about it too much. I'll tell you the one language I really do wish I had learned when I was a kid was Japanese, because just because of the sheer volume of things in that language that I watch, especially now with a lot of anime that I watch, I would give anything to be able to watch that without subtitles. Mostly because so often subtitles are horribly wrong and bad. Luckily, that's not the case for this movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I assume as far as watching the movie, it's the same for you. Like you probably don't notice too much.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, on my first viewing, I was so wrapped up in it that even though I was, having to read the subtitles to understand what was going on, it was on the scale of 1 to 10, it was probably like a 2 at highest, like in terms of being hard to follow. Now it's basically a 0, because I know this movie so well that even though I do read the subtitles because the dialogue is so lyrical and beautiful, and I do want to fully appreciate it, I know what the characters are saying. So if I happen to be wanting to pay attention to something else on the screen, I can just be watching that and kind of still follow along with the story. And also, while I am far from fluent in Spanish, I do have enough of an understanding that I can hear the characters and like hear what they're saying, and even without the subtitles, pick up most of it. I would not be able to like speak it. I would not be able to recite it, in Spanish, but I can understand what the characters are saying and certain words and certain cues. So it really is not a barrier for me at all. And I'll just bring up the famous quote that Bong Joon-ho had when he won at the Oscar for Parasite, the first foreign language film to ever win the Best Picture Oscar, when he said, "Once you overcome the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles, you will be introduced to so many amazing films." And I could not agree with that more. And for this movie, it is, a testament to just how powerful I find the story, that, again, I truly don't even notice that this movie is in a different language than the one I grew up speaking, because it just draws me in that much.
I will say the one recent example, and it's not even technically a foreign language film, but there are a lot of subtitles where it caused me to reevaluate how close to the screen I was sitting. I went to my last IMAX showing of Dune Part 2, and I said, I'm going to sit up closer to the screen this time to really like take it in. And oh my God, it was like overwhelming but I only lasted like the first 20-25 minutes, because as soon as the movie turned into mostly, the Fremen talking, I realized that having to have my eyes dart down to the subtitles and then back up to the main action, because everything was so big, it was noticeable in a way that it normally isn't when I'm either sitting further back at the theater or when I'm watching at home, because that's when you really notice your eyes going like,
yeah.
So that's like the only time in recent memory that subtitles have been an issue for me. But otherwise, it's not even noticeable. I would love to have a video camera on me just to see like what my eyes are doing when I'm watching a foreign language film, because they must be like darting all over the place. But let's start. Pause for a second. When we get back, because we've talked to sort of overall about a lot of the some of the themes in the movie, and then sort of shot to the ending. And I want to make sure that we go back. We'll start talking about some of the individual characters, but first let's just pause and do the mid roll. Next week we're celebrating somebody's birthday, Jared.
Yeah.
And we are going to be talking about. Let me see if I get the one right. Is this one Before Sunrise?
It is.
Is that it? Because all three of the titles are a little similar. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about that. That'll be. I'm going to look online and see. I'm sure I can rent it on like Apple movies and stuff, and it'll be my first time seeing the movie, so looking forward to that. And then the week after that, we're going to be. Can you believe it? We're going to be doing our final stream on The Bad Batch.
I can believe it. It's just we're in the grieving process of getting ready to say goodbye to that wonderful show. But I'm ready to see it.
I will say, like, I found myself nodding in agreement a little bit with some of the talk that was going on when our friends at Force Center were talking about the last episode. There's this vibe for me of like, I'm waiting, like, not in a bad way, because I've loved everything that we've gotten coming up to the ending, but it does feel, I'm getting nervous about the fact that it does feel like in other shows there'd be like more of a ramp up to like a big dramatic, like large scale ending, and it feels like they've been going against expectations in that regard. So I'm very interested to see how everything comes together because we've only got 2 episodes left, and even though I have a general notion of what the ending's going to be now, they're all headed towards Mount Tantus, but what's going to happen? It doesn't feel like the odds are in our hero's favor at the moment. Their numbers are a little lopsided. Unless they're able to, well, we'll leave this for when we actually discuss about it. Because everybody else who's watching today, who isn't caught up on the Bad Batch, is like, what are you guys talking about? Needless to say, you should be watching it. It's pretty much like, my favorite Star Wars Disney Plus show ever. So, yeah. And then after that, it's kind of up in the air for the moment because I know we've talked about then watching the second film in the before trilogy, but also we're already alternating Star Wars stuff. So we have to decide if we're going to mix things up a little bit more. But that'll be a bit easier to predict once we've done next week's stream. And maybe I'll be so crazy over that film that I'll say, oh, screw it. Let's just do a whole month of alternating Star Wars and indie filmmaking. But we do have a lot of Star Wars stuff coming up, even after the Bad Batch. We're going to be doing the 25th anniversary stream for episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which I can't wait for, just because it's, contrary to all the people who were telling me I was wrong all those years, like The Phantom Menace has always been one of my very favorite films and one of my favorite big screen experiences. And that'll start us off on our sort of alternating week coverage of the prequel films, and then who knows where we go from there.
Yeah. I am just a happy camper with everything that we have coming up. Even if, as you said, we may shake things up ever so slightly, but I do hope that if you do end up enjoying Before Sunrise next week, that we will find the time to talk about all 3 of the Before films, because they are, as I've mentioned, some of the most important films to me that I've ever seen. And while I find each one of them individually to be great, it really is the collective experience of the 3 and the trilogy and the overall arching story that makes it so special to me. So you'll get a little taste with Before Sunrise, and then you'll have to decide if or when you want to, take in the rest of the meal. But I hope that you do, even if we do end up, taking a little bit longer to talk about it on the channel, because it really is so worth it. And as I've mentioned several times to anyone who may not have seen it, they're different kinds of films. There's no death. there's no big action sequences. It really is very much focused on 2 people, what it's like to meet someone, to connect with someone at a very specific time and point in your life, and how that can change your life forever. And if you are open to that kind of filmmaking of 2 characters just having a conversation about life and love and everything that is important to them, it's very rewarding. And yes, thank you very much, Wheezy and Lady Starfall. I'm very, very touched, and I would hope that you may be able to join us next week. But even if not, thank you for those wishes. And I hope that I'll see some of you there when we discuss Before Sunrise, which it should be pretty easy to find. The movie came out in 1995. It's available to rent everywhere. I don't know if it's available to stream for free anywhere. I'd have to look. I have the DVDs, so I won't need to do that. But I know that they're not the most widely seen movies in the world. So if you manage to find it and watch it, join us as we talk about the first one before sunrise.
And come join us anyway, because it'll be Jared's birthday, or at least that's when we'll be celebrating his birthday. So, and when we did mine a couple weeks ago for Goldeneye, we had a bit more of a laxed format, and we goofed around a bit. So I'm sure the same will be true of this week, and so come check it out anyway. And don't be worried about spoilers. It's a 1995 movie.
Yeah. And it's also really not the kind of movie that you can spoil because, as I said, it's not the most plot-heavy movie in the world. So, I find it very, thematically rich and interesting, but it's not the kind of thing where if you know what happens, the experience is going to be any less, at least for me. And also, it's not the kind of thing where we're going to need to devote a lot of time to talking about, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. We're really going to talk more about how the movie makes us feel. At least I am. So hopefully you'll be on board with that.
And stop the presses. Kate has seen the movie we're discussing today. Oh my God. No, it has happened before, but it's rare. So great to see you, Kate. Yeah, and if you do want to watch it, it's just $4. And I'll be renting it because I don't own it. So yeah. Okay, so let's dive back in. We jumped around a lot. We just basically went right to the end, which is so emotional. I feel like we had to get our feels out of the way right there. Let's talk about the cast, because this is, being from America, it's not like this movie was filled to the gills with names that I recognized right off the bat, but I have never forgotten any of these actors since the day I first saw this film. And I have to get in one mention of feeling old, because that's just what I do. Even though people older than me are saying, "Shut up, John." But I, over the years, I've seen Ivana Baquero in a number of things, especially she was in a short-lived fantasy series based on what were the books called?
The Shannara Chronicles.
The Shannara Chronicles, and she was in that as an adult, grown up. And so I go back to watch this, and I'm like, oh my God, she was just such a little one. But she is just phenomenal in this, and it, I mentioned that show because she was probably the main reason why I watched the show, because I was like, oh my God, it's the girl from Pan's Labyrinth, and she's just so amazing in this, capturing that again, everything we've been talking about, that innocence, but capturing the horror of sort of what she's going through, and she is her sheer terror is at least granted, the Pale Man is a terrifying design and presence by the great Doug Jones, who we'll talk about, but it's her terror at trying to run away from him and get out of there that sells that whole sequence in the middle of the film, that is just so terrifying that it made Stephen King squeamish. And so she just does such an amazing job. And then we've also got, and if I'm butchering any of these names, I really do apologize. Sergey Lopez as Captain Vidal, who is just such a son of a bitch. He is fascism personified. Yeah, and apparently, I remember listening to the commentary of this movie. I guess he was actually known more for comedy roles. And it's just imagining someone who's normally so comedic and then flips over to being this fascist monster, and I'm going to actually stop. Let's talk about. Let's take our time to talk about the two of them because I don't just want to rush through them. But yeah, let's just talk about Ofelia and the performance,
Mm-hmm.
of the amazing Miss Vaquero, because she's just,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely stunning in this film.
Yeah, last week when we discussed Atonement, we talked about Saoirse Ronan's performance and how widely acclaimed it rightly was, how beloved it was. I called it one of the best child acting performances I've ever seen, and I feel about that very strongly. I honestly think that Ivana Baquero's might be my favorite child acting performance ever. It makes sense because this is one of my all-time favorite movies, and she is the inextricable heart of it. But what she does with this role is just astounding. Playing, this young, fundamentally good and innocent, somewhat lost girl, dealing with absolute horrors and fantastical elements that are beyond her comprehension, but also demonstrating incredible compassion, incredible bravery, incredible resilience, incredible depth of emotion. It just floors me every time I watch it. And I know that she hasn't gone on to act in a lot else after this movie. You had mentioned the Shannara Chronicles. I know that she went to school, she did other things. She hasn't gone on to become as much of a working actor in her adult years. I believe she's 29 now. But this performance is an all-timer. The movie does not work without her. And could another child actress have played this role? Perhaps. Would it have been as good? I have no interest in ever finding out, and we won't need to, because they captured her at this specific moment in time, and she just was the heart that this movie needed. And I sometimes feel that when you're dealing with child actors, you have to pitch things very carefully, because there are, for very good reasons, restrictions involved in filming with child actors. There are certain things that you cannot do with them on set. You have limited work hours. There are protections that are in place. And there are certain things where you may need to get a certain reaction from a child performer, but you can't tell them what it is they're actually dealing with or looking at, or what the scene is actually about, because it would be a violation of those laws that are in place for a reason. So you have to find another way. And I don't know how they did that for this particular performance, because I have a feeling that, when you're dealing with subject matter this dark, there were things that they were not able to convey directly to Ivana Baquero to get the emotional reaction necessary. But whatever it was that they told her in place of it, she found it, because her reaction to everything that happens feels so authentic. It does not feel like, sometimes for better or for worse, and child actors, because they're professionals in some cases, are wise beyond their years, and seem a little bit more mature than their age. But in her case, she feels exactly as old as she's supposed to be, and her reactions feel very authentic, even though she is a very mature young girl for her age. She's clearly had to grow up very fast. She has not lived a sheltered life. She has experienced the loss of her father. She's dealing with, her mother having married this cruel new stepfather. She clearly doesn't have many friends. One of the reasons I think she's so retreating into the world of fantasy stories is because this is what she has to kind of keep her mind and her spirit occupied. But there's such a spark of life and intelligence there, and it comes out in the moments when she's dealing with these unimaginable horrors. and, you know, courage in the face of overwhelming darkness and evil. It's incredible. I don't have enough good words for her performance.
Yeah, it was really in the quiet moments that like I was so enchanted, you know, watching today. I really love the moment between Ofelia and Mercedes after like um I'm trying to think of exactly when it is. It's before her mother dies, but it's when uh, she asks her to sing her a lullaby, and um, but but that's also when she says, "You're helping the men in the forest, aren't you?" And then Mercedes says back to her, have you told anyone? And she says, no, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. And then Mercedes says, I don't want anything bad to happen to you either. And it's such a beautiful, like, subtle performance. And like, I feel like ever since we've been in the post Game of Thrones era, that's like, it's underappreciated when a young actor is as amazing as they are, because let's face it, they must have made a pact with the devil with Game of Thrones to to get the number of absolutely phenomenal child actors that they did. Um, but like she is just so amazing in this at capturing, you know, um, like being a like really dramatic, you know, performer, and like you said, making all those beats feel authentic. Um, and You know, because in the years before this, like, and I'm not saying this against him, I have nothing but love for Jake Lloyd in the Phantom Menace. But there was a certain kind of like when you bring younger children into a movie, they're going to sort of get by mostly on a lot on sort of being cute and, you know, and having a sort of gee whiz attitude and being lovable that way. And it's was more rare that they were asked to really sell the drama in the way that adult actors are, you know, uh, that same weight that is expected, you know, of them. And so to see a child performer deliver this kind of performance was, especially, you know, when this came out, it was like, holy shit, she's absolutely amazing. And if you look on her Wikipedia entry, it's funny, you'll see, you know, like all the other listings for, you know, her roles, and then the Pan's Labyrinth section will be really thick with all these best, you know, young artist, you know, nominations and awards. She absolutely deserved it.
Yeah, and just as you said, like sometimes it, you know, it's the nature of the role. You know, one of the there have been no shortage of incredible performances by child actors, but sometimes there can be, I don't want to call them crutches, but there are things that, you know, kids are naturally good at, and that we can, you know, kind of play into those things, or they can teach, you know, use those elements to kind of get us to, you know, root for these kids. Like
Yeah,
if a kid is sassy, or is
yeah,
able to, like, you know, have quippy dialogue where they can like give as good as they get and put an adult in their place with a snappy comeback, we're probably going to like that kid. Or if we see the kid, you know, is like having a great time, or is you know, experiencing like sincere joy, or if they're like, you know, having a very natural, you know, a reaction to something, you know, that makes them happy or makes them sad, we're gonna, you know, resonate with that because we were all kids at one time and we know how those things feel. But for a kid like, you know, Ivana Bacaro playing Ofelia, dealing with things that, God willing, no child should ever have to go through, you know, that takes a different level of skill. And particularly to draw, as I mentioned, to draw that performance out of a child actor where you have to do it in a certain way in order to keep the actor safe and comfortable when dealing with this very dark and heavy material. And what Guillermo del Toro, the way he directed her, and the way that the other actors work with Ivana Bacaro, and her own inherent understanding of her character, what they found here is the reason that this movie has the emotional power that it does, because we care about Ofelia so much and want things to work out for her so badly, and we fear for her, and we're devastated alongside her, and we might be feeling those things if we just were seeing it happen to her, but we're there with her because of the way that she conveys it through her performance. And that's why it just is a gut punch, when she experiences these losses and these tragedies and this pain, and that really is the key that most of her performance is pitched in. Obviously, as I mentioned, she also demonstrates incredible courage, but this movie is a very serious movie. She does not get many of those quippy one-liners or jokes. It's incredibly heavy drama, and it all rests on her shoulders, and she bore that weight, again, better than pretty much any child actor I've ever seen handling such material.
Yeah, the closest she gets is her, and she keeps going back to the refrain of "He's not my father," and which in of itself is very dramatic and very courageous of her to to stand firm on that when everybody else is so terrified of the captain. But instead of segueing to him just yet, I'm actually going to flip up the order here, because one of the people who has a lot of shared screen time with Ofelia is the faun, and let's just talk about the genius of Doug Jones, who I love him even more than I used to, because over the past year I had binge watched Star Trek. Why did I just blank out? Because I'm watching multiple Star Trek shows. The newer one.
Strange New Worlds?
No. Well, not that new. The
Discovery.
Discovery. There we go. So I kept wanting to say Voyager, and that definitely is wrong, because I've been watching Voyager. But Star Trek Discovery, and he's on that, and he is just so damn lovable on that show. And he gets to be more himself on that show, even though he is very much still under makeup. But it feels like the most Doug Jones he can be under prosthetics. This, on the other hand, he is very much in disguise, but nobody else could possibly play the roles that he plays in this. First of all, as the faun, who is, it's so funny to me that this came out the same year as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's like we've got James McAvoy, cute faun, and then got Doug Jones, terrifying faun, but then sort of lovable in his own way. What's interesting, and I'm probably stealing this from the commentary track, but the fact that the faun starts off as, he's a very sort of welcoming figure, and we have a bit more trust of him right at the beginning, because he seems very friendly and sort of welcoming, but his appearance is like he's older looking, and he's very crusty, and it's funny that the further the movie goes on, he gets younger and sort of more beautiful looking, but we trust him less. And until, of course, the end, when it's revealed, oh no, he he was okay all along. But I just love that dichotomy of, and it goes again back to Tolkien with Strider, the whole looking fairer and feeling fouler thing. And yeah, it's just, he's amazing. The work that he does, and I know there was some like visual effects trickery done with certain elements, just like with the legs. I think maybe we're removing some green, material with, like, covering up Doug Jones' actual legs, probably with green, and then taking that out and stuff like that. But so much of it is just his movements, and it's just absolutely amazing. This is one partnership that I hope never goes away, and I would be shocked if it did, that of Guillermo del Toro and Doug Jones, because those two guys together just create magic.
Yeah, he is one of the best in the world at what he does with these types of performances, because it's all in the physicality and the small affectations, because yes, it's incredible costuming, it's incredible makeup, it's incredible visual effects, and they're all blended together. But ultimately, there is a real human under the disguise of this faun, and that human is Doug Jones, and he is part of what makes the performance such an indelible fantasy creation. And the only reason I say part of it is because I also want to credit Pablo Adon, who is the voice of the faun, as well as the narrator. Famously, in one of the anecdotes that you will always hear when discussing this movie, Doug Jones did not speak Spanish at the time that this movie was being made, and he read the script in English and was like, "This is incredible, I can't wait to be a part of this." And then he found out the movie was going to be in Spanish, and he was like, "Oh no, I don't know if I can do this. I won't be able to serve Guillermo's story well." And Guillermo del Toro was basically like, "I don't care. You're the only actor for this part. I want you to portray these roles." And so we trusted him. And together, along with Pablo Adon, they created one of the most, brilliant and indelible creations in recent fantasy cinema. Because he's a fully formed character who is not just there as Ophelia's, guide. He has his own agenda, very much so. And he starts off as what appears to be a benevolent figure, and then you find out that he has a very dark edge to him. And when Mercedes warns Ophelia, "My mother taught me to be wary of fauns," we were feeling that, because when we first see him, we're a little bit scared of him, but he's like, "Don't be afraid, I beg you." And then he seems nice enough. But then he starts to kind of have some affectations that made us go, "Can we trust this guy?" When he shows up.
After Ophelia is given that warning, then she's like, "How can I believe what you say is true?" And he's like, "Why would a poor faun like me lie to you?" And it's like, okay, that's suspicious.
Yeah. And the moment that I always think of is after she completes the first task and she comes back to, present him with the key, and he emerges from the shadows and he's chewing on some kind of meat. We don't know what it is.
Yes.
and he seems to be enjoying it. And then she is like, "Hello, I got the key." And then he's like, he looks at the statue behind her and he's like, "That's me and that's you." And she's like, "And who's the baby?" And he's like, "So you retrieve the key." and you're like, "No, wait, back up. I think that's going to be important later." And spoiler.
Well, and again, like, it's stuff like this that makes it more than, okay, she's imagining all this. The fact that the faun has like ulterior motives, and and all these little touches, that's what sells like everything about this film. Is everything is treated with the same level of reality as everything else, and so I just love that sort of that build up to the end, where where you get like what he's going to be asking of her, and it's so great. And yeah, it's, and like I said, this came out the same year as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, so it was just so weird going from James McAvoy faun, Mr. Tumnus,
Yeah.
to the faun of this movie, which, by the way, should point out for those who don't know, the title of this film is not actually Pan's Labyrinth, because the name of the character in this movie is not Pan. That's like a figure from mythology that's sort of different, but of course studios are going to studio. The title of this film, actually translated from Spanish, is The Labyrinth of the Faun. So just for anybody who didn't know. And yeah, it's, so he's just great in that. And it just freaks me out, he just comes from out of the shadows. And then, like, when he's going away, he just crouches down into the shadow. But I just picture, like, then Guillermo del Toro being like, "Okay, cut. You can stand up now, Doug."
The magic of movies.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
But
the faun is not the only character that Doug Jones plays. He also plays. Rather than just say his name, I'm going to pop this up first. The Pale Man, who is one of the most disturbing and creepy creations in all of cinema.
Yeah.
And like, by the way, how he gets to this point is he starts off like this. Those are his eyes on the plate. He puts those eyeballs into his palms, then holds up his hands to see. Oh, and he eats babies. Yeah. Oh my God. This scared the shit out of me when I saw this movie the first time. It still scares the shit out of me.
Rightfully so. I mean, this is pure nightmare fuel. Like this, for a creator and a filmmaker like Guillermo del Toro, who is renowned for creating iconic monsters, the Pale Man probably is his most iconic and his most terrifying and his most like elemental in its distillation of what it is that the creation of monsters is meant to bring out of us. And some of it is just the very basic primal reaction of making us feel afraid and unsettled, because all you have to do is look at this guy and you are immediately like set on edge, because as the faun says before he sends Ofelia into this lair, the creature that slumbers there is not human. And that always puts a chill up my spine, and it is very much the case. And obviously, like, it would be one thing if he just looked freaky, because we've also seen that in fiction where it's like the character looks monstrous, but actually the story is that they may be monstrous on the outside, but they are very much, have a true heart on the inside. Not this guy. This guy is a monster within and without. He is a murderer and a devourer of children. So that is about the most elemental kind of horror that you could imagine, because when you think about what kids are afraid of, the creature that lives under their bed, in their closet, in the shadows, what is their greatest fear? That it will come out of the shadows and it will eat them. And that is what this monster will do. If given
if you want to draw the parallel that he looks like an old wrinkly white guy, I'm not going to dissuade you from that comparison. There's a politician he reminds me of. I'm not going to say who. Just going to leave it at that. But he is like just the thing of nightmares. And this is what I was talking about before, where when Stephen King saw this movie, he was like squirming in his seat, when the Pale Man is chasing Ofelia. And it just, Oh my God, it's just something else. Um, Eats babies, they always eat babies. Yeah, and the fact that I have the art book, the art and making of book for this film, and the fact that they actually got like the detailed drawings of, that you actually see like on the wall in his lair, you know, of him like eating babies, and it's like it's just like, okay, nobody come check on me while I'm reading this book. It's just like it's ingenious design work, and again, Doug Jones, like nobody else could play this character, like not because he's like the Pale Man, but because of his physique, and you know, and the way he moves. Just uh, but this whole sequence really does get into what you were talking about before about Ophelia and the fact that she won't just do what she's told because she's told to do it. And yes, it gets her in some trouble in this sequence, but it's still not necessarily treated as a negative thing. Um, you know, because then again, like you said, we get the words of the doctor of, you know, to obey without question just for the sake of obeying. That's something only men like you can do. And and so Ophelia, you know, paying attention to her own, you know, sort of decision making, like it's funny. It's because earlier we get where she goes for the different, uh, you know, to unlock the different, what would you call it?
Doors, key,
Door.
like
Yeah, the different one than what the fairies are telling her to open. So she's listening to herself in that moment, and so it's the same with the grapes, but it does get into trouble. But she gets herself out of it. But uh, and we're made to think that the faun is actually angry with her for doing this, but in fact, like, you know, and there's even like some like reason to believe that, as terrifying as a prospect of it is, that maybe the faun and the pale man are actually one and the same. And that this is all part of the test, and it's to, you know, and that the very point is that she should make up her own mind, and you know, and that is revealed, of course, in the final test when she once again does not obey him, and refuses to spill the blood of her brother. So the message here is uh, to do as, you know, to not just blindly follow orders, but to listen uh, to herself and her conscience. So
yeah. And her this entire sequence, you know, of Ophelia's three tests, you know, the we talked extensively about the final test, you know, giving, you know, being offered the chance to sacrifice her brother in exchange for eternal life and refusing to do so, which is the most important test and the one that is the most emotionally powerful. This is the second, and this is the one that, you know, is probably her greatest, you know, trial in terms of how close she comes to failing it. And it raises an interesting question, as you said, like if this all is a creation of the faun, or the pale man is somehow an agent of the faun in some way, like what the cost would have been for her to truly, you know, fail this. Because as you say, like when she enters into this layer of this demonic creature, she demonstrates incredible courage and perhaps even a little bit of recklessness, because when she arrives and she sees him slumbering there at the table with the sumptuous feast laid out in front of him, she does not seem like her first instinct is to run away. She is committed to the task, and if anything, she's curious and a little bit disgusted by it. But
I know. I was thinking when I was watching this today, I was like, "You don't turn your back on it."
Yeah.
Like that seems like something you should keep an eye.
Yeah.
But she's much braver than I am.
No, and that is a testament to her strength of character, as is, as you pointed out, the fact that the fairies are trying to get her to open a certain door, and she, doesn't follow those orders blindly. She says no, it's this other door. She trusts her own instincts, and she is proven correct once again, as she will be later. But as we, there's always a lesson in the, like, the possibility of, like, what it means to defy authority, which is that, it's presented as a good thing, like, to obey without, questioning is an act of evil in this film. But sometimes those rules are in place for your safety, and in this case, she ultimately, her act of defiance and disobedience and just simple hunger because she is a child, almost leads to her death. And that is, an
Well,
element of
and her grabbing the food is not like, even though she's been warned against it, it's not unreasonable because, like, the food has been scarce and they've been handing
yes,
out those ration cards. So, like, there's only so much food that's been going around. So she's probably like really hungry.
yeah,
And yeah, so but still, it's like I I like how she's like, you know, I only took 2 grapes. I didn't think anyone would miss
yeah.
them. Like that actually right there I find to be one of the most comedic lines, because it's like, well, if it hadn't have been for the fairies and the pale man getting up, I don't think you would have stopped at 2 grapes.
No, probably not. But her instinct is not necessarily wrong. Like, in the
Yeah,
real world, like, missing, two, very few people would notice if 2 grapes were missing. And there is, like, when we talked about earlier about, like, the real world and the fantasy worlds kind of being laid on top of each other. I've seen analysis where this scene, the dinner table, is very much set up like the dinner that presided over by Captain Vidal that Ofelia missed because she was out in the woods completing the first task. And,
and
the
the pale man is placed in the same
yeah,
position as the
yeah.
captain. Yeah,
And the idea that, the Captain Vidal is like, he generally treats Ophelia as beneath his notice, and she's safe that way until she takes something of his that he, notices, and then he tries to kill her. And that, that's the kind of, like, thematic and, subtextual layering that makes the movie richer when you realize it, but you don't necessarily need to realize it on the first watch, because the
yeah,
sequence is effective enough in on its own. But there's intentionality there, and I personally feel that this is, like, the pale man is not meant to be a pure metaphor. He is meant to be an elemental and terrifying being, but he is also reflecting the movie's overall themes of greed and, murder and selfishness as embodied by the fascists and Captain Vidal in particular. And in this case, it's just a much more elemental understanding of it. And this is a case of where, if Ophelia is trying to use these fantasy realms to make sense of the horrors that are happening around her, you could see how she might contextualize something like this with a monster who, seeks to devour her when she disobeys authority.
yeah,
And so but the sequence, as we said, also just works on a pure, like, elemental, terrifying level, because just look at this guy, and and that entire sequence where after he wakes up and she's fleeing from him down the hall and trying desperately to use the chalk to create the door to escape from him, it is one of the most, you know, viscerally terrifying sequences that I've ever seen in a movie.
And it's really just horrifying. Like after she closes the door, how you still hear him like banging to get through. Like that's a wonderful touch that just is like that adds to, you know, sort of the realism of it all, that, you know, like he's still under there. Oh god. Just it is like the standout sequence in the film, and just one of the most brilliant, you know, um like in the annals of cinema. Like, first of all, I mean, obviously the movie itself is, you know, classic, but I think there's a lot of people who, even without having seen the movie, know about the Pale Man.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about like you know, the movie and the fantasy sequences as like being a way of, you know, of coping. Sorry, just knocked my mouse down. Coping with the horrors of reality versus it being like just being what they are in their own world. And for me, it is both. Um, I did want to touch on this because I actually have a book which is an adaptation of the film, uh, written by Guillermo del Toro, his name's on it, but it's mostly by Cornelia Funke, which is basically expanding upon the movie in the sense that a lot of the fantasy elements are given more focus and expanded upon to give you like legends of those stories. So it really embraces the fantasy elements in that. It's been a while since I actually read it, so I might now that we're talking about the movie, I might give it another look, just because it's really good. And but yeah, this whole sequence like just lived in my mind, and it's one of those things that just terrifies you, and it is the stuff of nightmares. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a
Bye, Lady Starfall. Thank you for joining us.
yeah. Thank you, Lady Starfall. And yeah, it is a feat of pure imagination, and you know, I would hesitate to call this movie like a pure horror movie, but it definitely has horror elements, and this is the most horrific sequence, at least among the fantastical realm, you know, because there are very much, and perhaps this is a good way to transition to talking about it, but the real world elements of this movie are arguably even more horrific because we don't have to stretch our imaginations quite so far to envision these things possibly happening. But we feel the visceral tear, I think, of the Pale Man a little bit more just because it is, to us, such a strange and alien thing. And our subconscious is trying to reckon with that, like what this thing is and what it means. And the unknowable is always more terrifying than something that we know. And for someone like Ofelia, who is still coming to terms with like the world and its cruelty, you know, it's even more scary because we, unfortunately, as a more adult audience, have a bit more understanding of what we would call the banality of evil and the evil of the fascist characters in this film.
Yeah, the fantasy part of it's what allows you to actually face the terror of the real world, and it's what's so powerful about storytelling in general, especially fantasy storytelling, is you know, and it's why I always sort of, you know, and this goes back to my love of Tolkien and what he wrote about, and like the idea that it's just escapism is like rubbish, because it's a way for you to confront the darkness in the real world that otherwise you couldn't bring yourself to confront. It's coming face to face with truths that are too difficult for a lot of us to face in our everyday lives. But when it's within a fantasy setting, then we can actually process those things.
And I think that is a perfect segue to talking about the movie's true villain, Captain Vidal, played by Sergei Lopez. As
Such a nice guy. I mean, really, he's a winner. Could you ask for a better? I don't think Ophelia's mother could have asked for a better husband. What do you think?
Oh, clearly not. It's he is monstrous, and there's just enough humanity there to let you know that he has it and that he is a very human character, which makes it all the more horrific when he discards that humanity and does the same for others, because this is a man who sees no value in any lives that do not serve his direct purpose. His speech that he gives to the assembled people at the dinner table, when he is talking about the fact that, like, these people who are hiding up in the woods, these guerrilla fighters, these remnants of a defeated army, the Republican Army that lost the Spanish Civil War, they're holding on to this idea, a mistaken idea, that we're all equal. And that is very much his moral philosophy. He is the quintessential embodiment of what it means to follow a fascist ideology. He sees the people beneath him as either things or a means to an end or disposable, and he will discard them either to serve his own purpose, or just because they're in his way, or just because he can. And we see all of those throughout this movie. We see him when he kills the farmers, who were hunting rabbits in the woods. He does it because they dare to speak out of turn. They pose no threat to him whatsoever. He just executes them because he has the power to do so.
One of the most gruesome death scenes ever, just the way that he takes the bottle and smashes it into the son's face. It is just like so horrific, and also the gun violence in this movie is so, like, it's not shied away from it, and in the way that we see a lot of times people just shot right in the face, and it's just, this is not a movie that shies away from the violence.
Yeah, and the violence is very realistic. It's heightened in certain aspects, but the simple brutality of it is an unfortunate fact of the realities of war. And
it doesn't necessarily, I want to be careful the way I phrase this, like, it is very present and it's meant to horrify you, but at the same time I wouldn't necessarily call it gratuitous either, because it's done with a purpose.
No, the movie does not revel in the blood and the violence and the death. It does the exact opposite of it. Every time it deploys horrific violence, it is doing so to show you exactly that, how horrific and tragic and unsettling it is. And Captain Vidal's comfort level with that level of dehumanizing violence is what makes him a monster. And what made him the way he is we don't necessarily get the full picture. We get enough. We learn that he was, the son of a famous general who died on the battlefield, and clearly that left an impression on him, despite his insistence to the contrary that it didn't. We see him carrying around his father's watch, and the anecdote about it conveying the exact time and day that his father died. But we also have to take him at his word when he says he believes exactly what he says, that he wants his son to grow up in a new, clean Spain, basically free of these the people that he sees are less than. And he's willing to do whatever it takes to achieve that end. And whether that's feeding his ego, or whether that's feeding his insecurity, or whether that's just he's just the kind of man that, as the doctor says, will obey, for the sake of obeying. We don't get a clear answer which one is the driving force, but it ultimately is all of them. And perhaps the most terrifying element of it that the movie doesn't reckon with is that, as monstrous as this guy is, he's not alone. He is a member of the victorious Falangist army that won the Civil War. And Pedro in the woods, the Republican guerrilla fighter, and the doctor, when they have that conversation, the doctor makes the very unfortunately salient point that when you kill this guy, they're just going to send another one just like him. He is not ultimately like the ultimate embodiment of this ideology. He is just a piece of that machine, and he's entirely comfortable being that. And the acts that he does, these dehumanizing acts, are not because he is like the Dark Lord Sauron who wants to lord over all. He is just so comfortable with the process of dehumanization that he doesn't see the value in human life. And we see it in the way he treats everyone around him. And that ultimately proves to be his undoing, because the characters who he considers beneath his notice, like Mercedes, like Ofelia, are ultimately the people who lead to his own demise, because he couldn't fathom the idea that Mercedes would betray him, because she was just a woman. And he couldn't fathom the idea that these Republican, guerrilla fighters would manage to defeat him until they do, because clearly they're just rats or dogs or whatever dehumanizing term he would ascribe to them. He is ultimately a character who just will do whatever he needs to do to destroy light and life. And that sounds a little bit melodramatic, but when we consider the fact that he is this movie's true monster, like, that is what we're ultimately reckoning with. Like, the true monster at the heart of the maze is just a man.
Yeah. Just real quick, want to make a note, and not just yet. Your birthday is on the 30th, right?
Yes.
And we will be celebrating his birthday next Sunday on the 28th. So make sure you all come for that. But I'm sure you'll accept birthday wishes whenever they're sent your way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I really like, the sort of parallel drawn between Vidal and the Pale Man, because the Pale Man is like, we have, with Vidal, we've got this, sort of, his demeanor makes him seem monstrous anyway, but outward appearances, he looks like a very handsome fellow, but on the inside, the Pale Man is exactly like, that's the monster within. And yeah, it's just, and the actor does such a great job. I mean, like I said, I find it really funny that he was known for comedic roles, and he does such a great job playing such a monster. But they do say that comedy is harder than drama. So
Yeah,
um,
and I actually find myself, even though I don't really know if there's a direct connection between these two or not. I find myself thinking a lot about an actor like Robin Williams, who was very famous for
yeah,
playing comedic, wacky, silly roles that, kind of like show off that kind of the lighter side of his humanity. But then when he wanted to, he could also play incredibly grounded and empathetic characters like he did in Good Will Hunting, or monstrous characters like he does in Insomnia or some of his other films. And he could be terrifying, even though he was known for being a kind of a wacky comedic performer, in his most famous roles. And I have to confess, I'm not as familiar with Sergei Lopez's, other work, his more comedic work. This was the first thing I ever saw him in, and so that's always going to be stamped on my memory. But I have to imagine that when Guillermo del Toro cast him and fought for him to be cast, he was thinking about the fact that an actor who could play those, like, that kind of elements that deal with like the humor and the lightness and the absurdity could also grasp what it would mean to portray a character who lacks any of those qualities and bring it to bear in this kind of truly horrific fashion. And it's a fantastic performance, one of the best villain performances I've ever seen.
I'm struck by one of the most like one of the beats of the movie where you hate him the absolute most is when they've captured the prisoner, um, and who stutters, and he says, "If you can count to three without stuttering, I'll let you go."
Yeah.
He's such a son of a bitch,
Yeah.
and and the way when of course, the poor man isn't able to do it, and he just says, "Too bad," and then just commences with beating and torturing him, and it's just
Yeah.
uh,
It's that in particular sequence is one of the most horrific cuts to black that I've seen in a movie, because the movie generally deals with like wipes for its transitions, like, or camera pans, but that's like an actual like harsh cut to black. And like, it's building to it and building to it, because in your heart that like this poor stuttering man is not going to be able to do something as simple as count to three in this guy's presence. And then when, as you say, he says the first, and the Vidal offers that encouragement, that sinister encouragement, and then the second, but then he can't get out the three, and then you just see Vidal smirk, and he says, "Shame," and then he swings the hammer at this guy's face, and you just hear the sickening crack right as it cuts to black. Your stomach just drops. And then it's a very smart choice that we don't actually see the act of torture. That would be a case of, as you said, like the film kind of reveling in the gratuitous brutality. It does not. It shows us the aftermath.
yeah,
And it's
which
the
is
aftermath.
just as horrifying.
Yeah.
It's oh god, and then of course there's but the great return to that moment
Yeah.
is when we're getting the similar beats of him saying the same stuff about how when he's going to be able to trust what he's saying, because and then going through the process of showing like each level of the torture, and he repeats that to Mercedes when she's found out, only he's once again underestimating her because she cuts herself loose and then stabs him repeatedly, then sticks the knife in his mouth and cuts the side of his mouth open. It is one of the most satisfying moments like ever. Um, and it seems like a great time to bring in talking about the character of Mercedes, and let me make sure uh, the actress's name is Maribel Verdú, I think, and she is just amazing. She is such a strong, character, and strong-willed, and but then also she's one of the most tender people in the entire film. I love her relationship with Ofelia, and the only miscalculation she makes is when she, makes a run for it. It's like I got it because she was scared, but Vidal clearly knew what was going on, and he was just waiting for her to run. So like that's the only misstep she makes. And well, that and forgetting to tell her brother, at least make it look like you broke in instead of just unlocking the door. But yeah, no, she's just amazing, um, and it's so great when to have, because we have Ophelia's mother, as she is actually Ophelia's mother, but then we also have Mercedes as a very motherly figure towards Ophelia, someone who's there for her after her mother dies, um and even while her mother is sick, and is very tender and caring towards her. I mentioned earlier the lullaby scene, which is just, which by the way, this is the moment when I just have to like go ahead and tip my hat to I'm not gonna get his name right, but Javier Navarrete, maybe, for the Spanish composer of the score for this film. It is one of the most breathtakingly beautiful musical scores ever. And I will say, I didn't have the heart to correct you earlier because it still makes me angry, but he actually did not win the Oscar for Best Score that year. That was one of the ones they lost. He should have won.
Oh yeah, you're right. He did.
But it's, and the Pan's Labyrinth lullaby is just one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever composed. And it's just so heartbreaking when the end of the movie comes around, and Mercedes starts humming it, again, while holding Ophelia, and it's just, that's what like reduced me to tears when I saw this movie. I was like, oh God. It just pierces your heart in such a strong way. And yeah, so she drives so much of the heart of this movie, with like going from like hope to despair to like rage, and and everything in between. And yeah, no, I love her, and I love when she gets to gut you know Vidal, and she doesn't, like, even though she doesn't like technically deliver the killing shot, that's her brother, she delivers the killing blow with when she says to Vidal, no, he I forget what's the exact line. He'll never.
He basically had been saying, like, tell my son the exact time that I died. Tell him, and she just cuts him off and says, no, he won't even know your name.
Yeah, and that's it.
Yeah. No, she has.
Oh God.
Yeah, she is a triumph of a character. Like, picking favorites in this movie is impossible, but Mercedes is very much a character that we as the audience want to root for, and the performance by Maribel Verdú is outstanding because it's so laden with empathy and humanity and like absolute like compassion, but also fierce bravery and resilience. Like, what to me, honestly, like, not that it's like funny, but like one of the most amusing like little elements is when she's talking to her brother out in the woods, and they have that exchange where, you know, she calls herself a coward because she is like serving this guy and washing his clothes and everything, and you know, and she clearly loathes him with the fire of 1,000 suns, but she's doing it to serve a greater purpose. And we kind of just have to smile at that because we know, her brother knows, she is the furthest thing in the world from a coward. To do something like this, what she's doing, is one of the greatest acts of courage that you could ever imagine, because she is like literally living in the wolf's den, and you know, providing the means to help her brother and what she believes in, you know, stay alive in this incredibly dark time. And the compassion that she shows to Ofelia is something that, you know, she just gives freely. She doesn't need to do that. It would probably be easier for her to not do so, but she just cares about her, like from the moment she lays eyes on her. And part of that is just because, you know, this is clearly a young girl who's lost and doesn't have, you know, any connections other than her mother, who's quite ill. And Mercedes like steps in to be that girl's protector and confidant. And, you know, Ofelia like takes, you know, seizes on that. And that theirs is the most, you know, truly authentic and realized human connection in this movie. And there's also a reflection there of like who Mercedes might once have been and who Ofelia could have been had she gotten the chance to grow up. You know, Guillermo del Toro talks about this in his behind the scenes materials about the rules of three that is present throughout this movie. And there are like, you know, there are three main fascist characters with Vidal, Serrano, and Garces. There are, you know, the three tasks, the three doors, like all these elements. He also talks about the three major female characters in the movie with Ofelia, her mother, Carmen, and Mercedes. And he rightly notes that, you know, Carmen is a little bit held separate because she's the mother figure who's also, you know, ill, but that Mercedes is also very much like who, like, he calls Mercedes and Ofelia like different stages of the same character. And where I think that comes into pass is when Ofelia and Mercedes have that conversation about fairy tales. When, you know, Ofelia asks Mercedes, like, do you believe in fairies? And Mercedes has that beautiful but also kind of heartbreaking line where she says, no, but when I was a little girl, I did. I believed in a lot of things that I don't believe in anymore. And you can kind of see how she clearly does still have very strong beliefs, but this is a woman who is very much grounded in the reality side of the story. She like has seen horrors happen to her family and are still happening because her brother is still fighting this war. And she has kind of let that fantastical belief go in the name of sheer practicality. And perhaps,
and it really,
yeah,
and like pulling on that thread a bit more to make you feel even more sad for Mercedes at the end of the movie, because you could even look at the death of Ofelia as like the final death of any innocence Mercedes had. And oh, oh God, in case the, you know, that part of the ending wasn't brutal enough. You know,
yeah.
but I think for her it is a very,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, it's a very bleak ending, you know, even though like they've sort of won this battle, you know, as is said, you know, there's going to be more coming. And so it's not a very, you know, it's not a happy ending for Mercedes and the rebels.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's great. And I do, yeah, no, you're not the only one, Cassie. And thank you so much for dropping in. Lovely to see you. And just having these images up, I am, you know, struck by the similarity between, if you look at this moment between Mercedes and Ophelia, and then later on when in this moment between the faun and Ophelia, just and maybe that would even be a hint of what ultimately the sort of ultimate revelation of of what kind of character the faun is. That's we may be led into thinking that he gets darker and darker, but of course in the end he's very much on her side. And yeah, no, I love it whenever we get that kind of symmetry, in movies. Yeah, no, did you have something more to say?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna make note about the fact that like Mercedes is ultimately like, as you mentioned, a maternal figure for Ophelia and fulfills that role of being her protector once Ophelia's mother unfortunately dies. But Mercedes also like has her own, battle to fight in this movie and her own arc, and like the her motivation to help her brother and the Republican guerrilla fighters who are hiding in the woods at the great risk to herself is a triumph in that way, even though it is a brutal ending, in the fact that, as we said, like the war is not over. It is notable and just a simple historical fact that the fascist regime that ruled Spain after the Civil War would stay in place until 1975. So the Republican fighters do not go on to win the war from this perspective. But this is a victory, and like this is what they can do in this time, and the fact that she is a part of that and she's willing to risk her life for it to help her brother and help her cause is a testament to her strength of character. And clearly, like, even though she calls herself a coward, she has incredible resourcefulness and strength of will, even though the fact is that she's not like fundamentally a killer, or cruel. Like, I know some people will take issue with the fact that when she finally has Vidal at her mercy, she doesn't, cut his throat. But that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to dehumanize someone to that extent that you can just, execute them in that way. And that's something that Mercedes ultimately, can't bring herself to do, even to a man like Vidal. But her speech to him in that moment, we had talked about, like, she gets the hammer line at the end of it when he ultimately is executed. But when she worms her way free and she has that line where she stabs him and he's shocked and he's kneeling before her and she sticks the blade in his mouth and she says, "I'm not some old man or a wounded prisoner, motherfucker, don't you dare touch that girl. You won't be the first pig I've gutted." That is like an all-time fuck yeah moment. Even, again, though she doesn't go on to kill him, but like that, it's just an incredible strength, display of strength from her there. And
It's
just the
not
effort
in
she puts away.
People have a tendency to think, especially in movies, like it's not an easy. I'm not saying that I know by personal experience, but you know, but even for me, it's sort of on the contemplation level. Like it's not an easy thing to even contemplate taking a life, and I think that for her, like it's not as simple as saying, "Oh, why don't you just kill him?" It's like it's not that
Yeah.
easy for certain people, and I really took note of sort of what it felt to me like as a viewer, and certainly no sympathy whatsoever for the fascists, but I was struck by when the reinforcements arrive, the way that the rebels shoot the fascist soldiers. It's all very much like it looks very much the same as when it's the reverse.
Yep.
And that's sort of like the horror of war. And not everybody has that in them. And that's not a sign of weakness. Um, it's just, it's just, it's one of those things that I imagine if you go off to war, you just have to come to terms with, and then some people won't. So it's, part of the reason why I'm always thanking my stars that I never, that I never actually had to face that, and and go off to war myself, because I don't think I'm built like that. And yeah, and we're not going. That's a touchy subject to get into. That I'll just leave it at that. But just to say that it's not an easy thing. And so to me, it's not as simple as saying, well, why didn't you kill him? And it's like, well, there's a lot of layers to that question. um, but she's just absolutely, yeah, as an actress, and a character, like, just so absolutely amazing. And you reciting that line, it, like, it really drives home, like, she gets some of the best lines in the movie. But someone else who gets some really good lines, and we've repeated it a couple times. One of them, is the Doctor, and he's another one of the great characters of this movie. And let me look up his name, because I actually don't know it off the top of my head.
Dr. Ferreira.
Yeah, and played by Alex Angulo. I might be butchering that. I apologize. Um, uh, he's just great, because and there's that tension throughout the movie of, because we sort of know from the beginning, when he's talking quietly with Mercedes, that there's something, that he's involved in with her, that you know and then it's revealed when they go off to the rebels. And you mentioned before about that quick cut, about the noise of that, of Vidal, really, hitting the captive. Another one of the more gruesome noises in this movie is when the Doctor has to saw the soldier's leg off, and we just get, like, the very first frame of it, and that crunching sound, and we're like, oh god. And that is actually one of the most, like, one of the most heart-achingly beautiful moments of the movie. Because, well, not that exact moment, but right before it, when the man who's having his leg cut off, where the Doctor's about to do it, and he says, "Un momento, Doctor," and he just takes a moment just to look at his leg, and then he says, "Okay, go ahead." It's just such a beautiful, quiet moment that I love it when, like, that's a character who's, like, in and out of the story in that moment. We get, like, 2 seconds with him, but it's such a powerful moment. Um, it's that's testament to the writing of this movie, that a lot of films and shows and stuff, they won't take the time to, like, let the world breathe, and let those characters breathe, who maybe they're not important to the overall story, but it's just, it makes us care for the rebels, and all those little touches. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that goes to what I think we mentioned earlier about, like, just, even though this movie takes place in a relatively confined location, like, there's so much depth, and all the people who live there feel like, they belong there, and have, like, real full lives, even if they're only on screen for a moment. And Frenchie, the poor soldier who has his leg amputated, is a perfect example of that, because that is his only scene. But
Yeah.
he just, you feel so much for him in that moment. And Dr. Ferrero, he is, a more prominent character throughout the movie, a very compassionate character, who, from the moment he arrives, he's trying to take good care of Carmen, Ophelia's mother, but also, help the rebels and help Mercedes, and also, try to avoid arousing the Vidal's suspicions. And we see that it's wearing on him, this effectively double life that he's leading. He's a character who clearly has lost a good deal of his hope and faith, even though he's still living it. He's doing the work. He no longer believes they can win. He just wants people to survive. And like, we see that he has deep affection for Mercedes, whether or not he is romantically in love with her or just has deep compassion for her. It's not really that material, but we see in that moment where he kind of confronts Pedro, Mercedes' brother, and he's basically like, if you really cared for Mercedes, you would take her away from here. And he, expresses that his fear is for her, not necessarily for him. But it takes immense courage to do what he does, not just to deal with the actual, ugly business of, the medicine in this era, like dealing with a woman who's having a complicated pregnancy with a threatened miscarriage and, possible placental abruption and things along those lines. And also he's, having to deal with, amputating this guy's leg without anesthesia. And he's doing it, but the thing he can't abide is when he is effectively asked to prolong someone's suffering. This poor man, El Tarta, the stutterer. I don't know if we ever get a name for that character, but he's another member of the rebel cell who we only meet very briefly in those moments, but he feels like a very rich character and our heart just aches for him. But when he's confronted in that moment with Vidal is basically telling him, keep this guy alive so I can keep torturing him. And then he gets a moment alone with the poor man, and the prisoner is basically just like, kill me, please kill me. And, that's for someone who's taken the Hippocratic Oath, that's a serious thing to ask. You're supposed to be a guardian of life, as a physician who's taken the Hippocratic Oath, I can say that it's a monumental moment but he does that because he knows that prolonging this man's life would not be saving his life. It would be condemning him to more torture. And so he disobeys, he helps euthanize this poor guy. And that moment when, the sergeant comes in and they see the doctor standing there with the needle that he's injected a lethal dose of opium, I believe it's meant to be. And the music just kind of swells and you just feel the weight of what the doctor's done. And all the more so because Dr. Ferrero knows in that moment, knowing Captain Vidal as he does, that he's signed his own death warrant. He is not going to, at best, he's going to be imprisoned. At worst, he's going to be executed, as he was. But he does it anyway because he's like, I cannot be a part of this. I will not be a part of this. And the line that he gives to Vidal, the famous line, to obey just like that for the sake of obeying, is something that only men like you can do. You can do, Captain. And then he just walks away. And as he's walking and the camera's holding on him, and we see Vidal come out behind him and pull his gun, and we know what's about to happen, but he doesn't turn around. He's accepted this, as the consequence of what he does, but he would have made that choice anyway.
It's one of the strongest moments for a character I've ever seen, where he knows that he's about to die, but he's not going to stand there cowering or just wait for it. He walks away and fully accepting that he knows what's coming. Although if he was dealing with someone who was less of a monster and at least had some common sense, that you're not going to want to shoot the doctor, maybe, especially when your wife is still in danger, even though she had been improving. But it's like, yeah, it's like you just shake your head because aside from the fact that it's a monstrous thing to do, it's also really dumb on Vidal's part.
Yeah.
Uh, and but man, what a great character the doctor was. Again, like I think in both Mercedes and Dr. Ferrero, you get the sort of the heart of of the rebellion that's going on, and it's the reason why we care about it. Um, and yeah, it's just I loved his performance. I just thought he was such a caring person, and yeah, it's a reason why like this isn't something like again, this isn't a movie like The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars with these sort of, what feel like, archetypal like characters that you're made to just always remember. Um, but because these characters like were so well defined uh, and were so brilliantly performed, like I've remembered all of them since I saw the movie in 2006, and as if they were, as just as classic characters as C3PO and R2D2 and Han Solo and, Aragorn and what have you. It's just they've stuck in my mind. And yeah, I love them. I, they just did such a great job of making us care about the people in this film. And even like what you were saying about Vidal, he's a monster, but there's enough of like not humanity in the sense like of like not showing that he's got the capacity to be a good person. He really doesn't. But that humanity of you that that there's like that he feels things and that and that it's the thing about when you're portraying villains and monsters like that is that it's always so much more chilling when you show that there is something human that's driving them rather than they're just you know mustache twirling villains who don't have any reason for what they do, and Vidal is more than that, but he's all the more monstrous because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we talk about like actors finding the humanity in their character, like we generally mean it in a positive sense, like of reaffirming those virtues that we associate with positive, traits of humanity, but also the darker elements, because of course humans have those as well. And Vidal is, the dark side of humanity embodied. He is, he's a sadist, he is a fascist, he is um, someone who is very much as we've kept saying, someone who will obey just for the sake of obeying, but also will treat those who don't obey him as things to be discarded. And obviously he needs to pay a price for that. This is, a fairy tale that, even though it has incredible, tragic elements to it, ultimately a character like that is going to need to be punished, get his moral comeuppance. And he does throughout this movie, and one of the reasons he's so monstrous is every time he encounters a setback, he doubles down, and becomes more entrenched in his ideology. And like we alluded to the fact that, he, in his very short-sighted moment, shoots the doctor. And of course, and that is the precise moment that his wife is having what will turn out to be a fatal hemorrhage. And they are, they have to call in the troop paramedic, and he isn't able to save her. But Vidal had earlier instructed the doctor, you have the choice, save my son, don't save my wife. Pretty, it's a terrible thing for him to say, but it's also like very much what his perspective is, that he sees his son as an extension of himself, of his legacy. This boy will bear my name and my father's name, save him. and really what he's saying is save my legacy. Like he does, we never see any indication necessarily like the relationship he would have had with his son, like as a father, because he never gets that chance. We can kind of extrapolate that his relationship with his own father, even though he clearly like is very driven by what his father's career as a soldier, you know, impressed upon him. Like we never get the chance to see what kind of father he would have been. I doubt he would have been a good one. And now his son will not even know his name. You know, that is his ultimate comeuppance, because really what this man fears most in the world is to be forgotten, to be washed away, you know, to not have made his mark upon the world. And he won't. You know, he dies here in the woods, forgotten, and you know, his son will never know his name, and the fascist regime that he devoted his life to, they're not going to mourn him. They're just going to send somebody else just like him to do the job that he failed to do. And that is a true commitment.
I do wonder how he sees his son beyond, you know, just like being an extension of him, if he has any hopes for what his son will do, because he also seems to have a fair amount of self-loathing as
Yeah.
well, because, you know, even fantasizes cutting his own throat. You know, but we're left to wonder about what is going on with all that, because it's not delved in too much. Um,
But that actually does raise like one moment that I actually think is quite insightful as to his character is when he has that, when they're fighting the rebels about midway through the movie and they're having that pitched battle on the hillside, and we see him like, you know, he's sheltering behind the tree, but he doesn't seem to be scared or cowering. He is like relishing the moment, and he kind of has that moment where he talks to his subordinate who is cowering, and he's like, don't be afraid, this is the only decent way to die, you know. And he is very much, you know, a character who's like, the only, it is my death, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die, you know, in battle. And the fact that he doesn't get that is another like comeuppance for him.
Yeah. Oh God. Um, but yeah, so I yeah, it's great that this movie like dives into that kind of darkness of, you know, everything that's going on, and you know, everything we've been discussing for the last little bit is so horrific, so you can see why, like, you know, it's, if this is all just an escape for Ophelia, then like it's completely understandable that you know, someone would need to retreat into um, you know, another world to just deal with everything going on around here. And like I said before, I do think it is very powerful that um, you know, that Ophelia, even though she ultimately does not survive these events, she's the one that's able to hold on to, you know, some semblance of innocence. And yeah, just you know, a beautiful story, but sort of circling back around to how we started the stream, I do think that what the film presents us with in the end is a, you know, more complex view of things, and that I like having the sort of, you know, for me, you know, going back to what I was saying before, I'm sort of, the word is not undecided, but I'm sort of satisfied in the ambiguity of the story, in that recognizing the darkness of what's presented as the quote unquote real world, um, but also like what we've been talking about, that the fantasy elements are treated with the same level of realism and respect, so that what Ophelia is facing, you know, uh, through the various challenges that she's put through is just as real as what's going on around her. And one of my favorite little bits is for anybody who says, "Oh, well, clearly it's all in her imagination." But then we get little touches like how she escapes from her room, which is the door is locked and it's guarded. Uh, but the faun gives her the chalk to make her own door. And, and then we see when Mercedes and the rebels, come into her room looking for her, we see that she had in fact made a door, and, but then there are bits like when Vidal follows Ofelia and, and he doesn't see the faun, he just sees her talking to nothingness, but also he's been heavily drugged. So there's that's kind of thrown in as a sort of, and there's several ways to look at that. He could not be seeing it because, because as sort of, a grown up and someone who wouldn't believe in such things, he's unable to see it because of that. Or he could be not seeing the faun because he's heavily drugged and or, or it's not there at all. But I love, like I said, I just love the ambiguity of everything and how it's not clearly stated, which to me is much more interesting than if it was clear cut one way or the other. I just think that's what makes it a beautiful, like, as Roger Ebert called the film, a fairy tale for grown-ups.
Yeah.
And I'm quite satisfied from my appraisal of, of where the movie stands in terms of what's real or not real, to just be in that happy middle, and enjoy the not knowing. And instead just taking everything as it's presented, with all the, that regardless of whether it's quote unquote real or not, everything that Ofelia goes through is just as real to her as everything else is real to the rebels and the soldiers, and everything. I'm always taken back to, a wonderful quote by Dumbledore. Of course it's happening in your head, Harry, but why should that mean that it's not real?
Yeah, I was thinking of the same quote, throughout this movie. It's very, very apt. And yeah, like they're like, particularly as we approach the climax of this movie, there are elements of it that they like. If you are trying to, fall more on the side that like none of this is all like, something that Ofelia has imagined or dreamed up, then it does fall upon you to come up with a rational explanation for certain events in the movie that are presented that for which there is not a rational explanation given. Like, how does she get out of the locked room if not through the magic chalk door? Or the scene later in the Labyrinth where she's fleeing the doll and all of a sudden the stones of the labyrinth like open up to allow her to pass and then return, and then the doll is like, can't seem to find it. And to be honest, like, I'm not as interested in playing that game. I also, I think I made it pretty clear, I come down on the idea that like these events are real and are happening in some form within this level of the physical world that we're seeing. But it also is just a, you could also think that like as the climax starts to approach, these worlds are starting to blur. The portal is opening in some ways, and I think that that's a fair interpretation as well. But regardless, it's a magical, experience in that way.
Yeah, what I ultimately always come down to is, and this is the way I approach a lot of cinema, is to set aside questions of, well, what's real? And the more important question is, what does the film want me to feel? And for me, that ultimately is the important thing in this film, especially. You know, when she's, when she arrives in the kingdom and is greeted by her mother and father and the faun, and it's, you know I mean, that, like we were saying earlier, that's open to the viewer. If you feel like that's just like a sad moment of she's dying and this is something she's seen before her death, then that's fine. That's, your prerogative. For me, like even if I approach it from a logical perspective of, well, it makes sense in terms of reality that this is a, quote unquote hallucination or what have you. That's, to me, it's clear that's not what I'm meant to feel in that moment. I'm meant to feel her reunion with her family, and and I'm meant to feel the fulfillment of the prophecy, and the fact that the blood, her blood was the blood of the innocent that was shed, and she was taken away from that world. Even if, like, the logical part of my brain says, okay, maybe that's, like, it makes sense why people shy away from that, but that's clearly what you're, from my perspective, like I said, what you're meant to feel in that moment. And I think that is very much driven home by the final line of the movie, which, is the voiceover of, you know, uh, you know, that she left traces of her, existence on Earth for those who know where to look. And so, if you're looking for that, then it's there, then it was real. And if you're not, then you're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, well said. It's one of my favorite final lines in any movie, and one of my favorite final images, final sequences, whatever you want to call it. It's just astonishingly beautiful, and the tragedy and the beauty of it is intermingled and can't really be, separated from one another. And for me, that is what makes it all the more powerful, because like the feelings I have watching that ending are feelings of just having been told a story that is everything about the human experience filtered through the lens of this fantastical adventure that this young girl has been on, and all the suffering that she's been through, but all the trials that she's faced, and the promise that says that she's fulfilled, and the rewards that she has found. It's outstanding, and I really feel like that is, it's one of the most emotionally fulfilling movies I've ever seen. And I love that.
There's movies that no matter how many times I've seen them, I'm still gonna cry like a baby at the end, and this is one of those movies. I didn't even watch it under like my most ideal conditions. I meant to watch it last night with the lights dimmed, and I was going to get out my 4K Blu-ray and do that whole thing. Instead, I watched it earlier today. I did turn down the lights in my room, but I was watching it on the TV in my room. So, like, not, still good conditions, but not like, you know, prime time movie event conditions that I like to have. But still, I was overwhelmed by the power of the story. And yeah, it's just one of my favorite films of all time. It's, as much as I've grown to despise ranking more and more, it is one of those films that after I saw it, got, you know, put into my top 10 list, and it hasn't moved. Um, it's just one of the greatest films ever made, uh, and like I said before, it's shot Guillermo del Toro up to like one of my all-time favorite directors. And I very much felt vindicated when he won at the Oscars for The Shape of Water, and won picture and director for that. And it felt like I love that movie too, but it did also feel like I can feel good about, it made me feel good about Pan's Labyrinth, and the fact that the movie still won the 3 awards, which were incredibly well deserved. But it was one of those where I was like, oh, it should have been up for even more. And so I was.
And I honestly think if this movie had come out. Yeah, no, I was going to say, and I honestly feel that like if this movie had come out with the Oscars of today, where there are now like a straight 10 Best Picture nominees, and a more international Academy, this movie absolutely would have been nominated for Best Picture. But I also think that it didn't need that validation, but it's also wonderful that it got it. Like in 2006, that this movie got 6 Oscar nominations and was like a financial success and like critically beloved. And famously, I've always like kind of teased about this anecdote, but the fact that it holds the record at the Cannes Film Festival for a 22-minute standing ovation, which even someone who loves this movie as much as I do, like I have a hard time imagining, clapping for 22 minutes straight at anything. But that's what they do.
Oh man, and when you get to that point where you've been clapping so much and your hands are feeling it, and you're like, when's everybody gonna stop? Please. It's like no matter how enthusiastic you are, you get to a point where your hands just won't take it anymore. No, I will say that was the year of like some movies unfortunately not being pushed for awards consideration until a bit late in the game. And the fact that this movie got 6 nominations, which were foreign language film, art direction, cinematography, original score, makeup, and original screenplay, that was still pretty amazing. When you consider that for a little while it did feel like this movie was flying under the radar, and then all of a sudden you started to hear a lot about it, and it was one of, like, I remember this being like one of the first big, like, international films that I really went crazy over. Obviously, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon back in 2000 had made a big splash. But for whatever reason, I wasn't as blown away by that back then. Probably because all my focus was on how much I loved Gladiator, and I was like, any other movie, it's just competition. But when this movie was coming out, I was like, holy crap. And so I was actually really happy with the nominations that it got, because that felt like an example of a movie that wasn't being pushed very heavily. And then the voters saw it and basically started, like, if it had been given just a little bit more time to build up steam, I think that it would have done even better. Another movie that year that was very similar was Children of Men, which, didn't seem to get a really good awards push until a bit late in the game. So that was actually a really great year of movies. It's just that most of the really great ones weren't nominated for Best Picture. Which of course is the way that it usually goes. But yeah, no, I stand by what I said earlier. It's just, this is one of the greatest films ever made, and at a time that was really important for fantasy filmmaking, where this was in the aftermath of Lord of the Rings, and fantasy fans were just kind of waiting to see, like, what form fantasy was going to take in cinema, like, after Lord of the Rings. And, like, was it just going to be a bunch of copycats and Certainly, there have been those, but also to see something like this was like, holy shit, you know, this is amazing, and yeah. And so, bottom line, I love this movie so much, and I'm glad we got to talk about it.
So am I. Before we wrap up, I did just want to make one quick note about a character we perhaps haven't talked quite as much about, which is Carmen, Ophelia's mother.
Yes.
And the reason is because before we started the stream, I did go back and watch your previous discussion that you had on this channel with AR and Stev and Cecilia, and you talked about Carmen quite a bit in that stream, and I would recommend anyone who's watching go back and watch that particular conversation because it's very, very interesting. But in particular, there was a conversation about like Carmen and whether or not she's a sympathetic character. Obviously, like what she goes through in this movie is horrific, and you feel for her, the loss that Ophelia suffers. And I thought that Cecilia in particular made some incredibly insightful and important points about like Carmen being a woman in this fascist realm who's like a single widow with a child and needing to make choices to protect her daughter and to survive that perhaps do not conform with what we and as modern audiences might want from like a strong independent female character. And I think that what Cecilia was talking about in that scene is like was very important to help us get into our understanding of Carmen, because she can be a frustrating character in the sense that she's not really as willing to indulge Ophelia's, love for fairy tale stories in the context of the real world. But we can see that she clearly like loves her daughter, and she does value the fact that these stories are important to Ophelia. There's that wonderful scene when they're in bed together and the baby's acting up, and so Carmen has Ophelia tell her unborn brother one of her stories, and she tells that absolutely beautiful fable about the rose on the mountaintop that gives eternal life but is surrounded by thorns, and men won't go near it because they're too afraid to be poisoned and die, and so the rose can't bequeath its gift to anyone. And there's a lot of symbolism there. Also with the first task, which we didn't really touch about as much, but the whole idea about, when Ophelia enters the tree and there's that outstanding shot of her like entering the, being framed again and backlit against the,
that poor dress.
Yeah, yes, indeed. But and like if you're looking for real world allegories in that, it's I do think that probably the closest allegory, and this is up for interpretation, of course, but is Ophelia reckoning with her her mother's pregnancy, and a pregnancy that is making her very sick. Like the whole idea that like has she's having to venture into this womb-like structure, and there's something in there that's unfortunately killing the tree it's beneath. Obviously, there are other factors as well. The toad is very emblematic of greed and the hoarding that the fascists are doing. But yeah, like as Eric says, like Carmen is a sympathetic character who's doing what she needs to do, and ultimately the fact that like as we alluded to earlier, like the Spanish Civil War lasted between 1936 and 1939. Unfortunately, the fascist forces under Franco won, and they ruled Spain for 40 years until 1975. Like they were within the context of Europe. We like to think about Europe. The great endeavor to free Europe from the tide of fascism and defeating Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And like ultimately there was great success there, but Spain remained under fascist rule for 40 years, and it's still reckoning with the trauma of that. And I do think that the character of Carmen kind of is meant to show another perspective about how characters deal with that. So she can be a frustrating character at times, but she's also incredibly sympathetic. And
well,
she's
and also there's also the, we'll call it ambiguity, but it doesn't feel that ambiguous to me, of how her and Vidal, quote unquote, met,
yeah.
and what transpired there. It doesn't, the movie doesn't spell it out, but it seems plain, and like, so with Carmen, it's a character who is dealing with, the horror of the world that she finds herself in, and as, and trying to, I hate to use the phrase make the best of it, but that's exactly all she can do, and so, um,
she's trying to survive,
yeah,
is what she's doing.
yeah, she's exactly, and so, yeah, I've never really viewed her as anything but a completely sympathetic character, because uh, it's clear what she's going through, and she's trying to shield her daughter from that as best she can, and as far as like her, um, sort of dismissal of, you know of Ophelia, like reading books and stuff like that. This isn't like modern day where the nerds have won, like that was pretty much, the typical, sort of mindset of, once you grow up, you should grow out of, like reading fairy tales and stuff like that. So I can't really like get angry at her mother for that, especially in the face of what's like going, as much as she's trying to shield her from the true horror of what's going on, and also not just at large, but within their own situation. Uh, there is, I'm sure, also a certain amount of her that wants Ophelia to be able to face the realities of the world as well. So trying to find that middle ground, I think, is like her saying, I'm going to keep you safe, but also open your eyes a little bit, and don't have your head buried in a book. Which, and of course, but it's that very thing that helps Ophelia sort of get through what, everything that she goes through, with, again, with her innocence intact, but still from from the mindset of the time, and what, attitudes of the time, and so, like, it's not really that unreasonable for her mother to be like, stop reading books for children, as she sees it. So
Yeah. And she also, like, as we mentioned, like, she does see that it's important to Ophelia. She just ultimately wants Ophelia to survive in this very cruel and harsh world, and she thinks this is the way to do it. And she's struggling to protect her because she is very, she's having a very complicated pregnancy. She's very, sick, and it's a complicated performance for Adriana Gill, the actor who portrays her, and I just think so does so very wonderfully, because she does have to spend much of the movie in bed, and ultimately, like, dies, and the movie's like truly tragic culmination. Like, the sequence where Ophelia loses her mother is, heartbreaking and horrific, as it should be. But the thing that I always like, I find that Adriana Gill does give, this Carmen moments where you can see, like, the woman that she was before, like the compassionate, caring mother that, Ophelia so reveres. And the moment that always just breaks my heart is when Carmen is very sick and she's lying in bed, and Ophelia is feeling very lost, and she has that speech to her brother where she, it's basically like, you're going to have to be born soon. And I just have a favor to ask. When you come out, don't hurt her. You'll meet her. She's very pretty, even though sometimes she's sad for many days at a time. You'll see when she smiles, you'll love her. And it just destroys you to
Yeah, and I think it's a great performance, and the only reason we went over it is because there's so many great performances in this movie, and a lot of like themes and different elements to discuss. But uh, but no, I think she does a great job, and there's a moment that I really do love between her and Ophelia when, after she's mad at her for ruining the dress, and Ophelia's in the bathtub, and I forget exactly what she says, but again, she references, Vidal as your father, and then Ophelia says, "You mean the captain?" Or I think she says, I'm very upset with you. So is your father. And says, "You mean the captain?" And then Carmen says, "Him more than me," which is both an acknowledgement of, yes, the captain, not your father. And also, maybe I'm not as angry as I'm letting on. And so it's a double victory for Ophelia in that moment. And also it is, I think, one of the moments where Carmen is allowed to sort of let out what some of her true feelings may be in this situation where she's trying just to, as you said, survive and to make the best of what's going on. So yeah, she has a lot of great moments, and I think it's no small thing also to just give like a really great performance of someone who's on the verge of death and then actually going through immense pain, and like you feel what she's going through. And that's the thing, like I do want to say, like this movie makes you really feel the pain that characters are going through, both emotionally and physically. Just touching on the end of the film again, I meant to mention this earlier, is when Vidal shoots Ophelia. I've never been shot, and I'm supremely confident this is nowhere close to the feeling of actually being shot by a bullet. But I will say that this movie made me feel the actual gunshot more than any other movie has. It just like, because you're in it with Ophelia, and so it really feels like it's just like a very simple thing. He pulls out that gun, pulls the trigger, and it just feels so immense and so powerful. And it's just the way they make you, really feel, everything in this film. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and the way that sequence is shot, like not the double entendre, but just like framed, cinematically, it's for such a horrific sequence, it's gorgeously filmed, and like it really, we need to underline it. Like, it is not typical for a movie to show us an adult shooting a child and killing her.
Yeah, and that's what I think that's a big part of what makes it so like makes it feel so painful and so jaw-dropping, is because you don't see that. And it's very horrific.
Yeah, and for the whole idea about like Ophelia has been trying to return to the underworld, and like the movie opens talking about a princess who, joined the mortal world, and she started to know death and pain and misery, and like she's experiencing all these things as she is about to potentially return to that realm. And the shot that where like after she takes the bullet and the camera like fixates on her face, it doesn't show us the wound, but then it shows her bring her hand into the frame, and the way it's covered with this just bright red blood that's almost like, glowing in the moonlight. It's it's a beautiful and horrific image. And
again, Javier Navarrete's score just over this sequence. Like, I think my two most played tracks on the soundtrack are the lullaby and then this sequence. It's just so like heartbreaking and stirring, and yeah, it's oh god.
Yeah, but it allows for that, the horror allows for the depth of the catharsis, once we get that sequence in the underworld, but still reminded of the very real world horror in the sense that, like, Mercedes' anguish at losing Ophelia is not really softened. It's, I mentioned earlier, just the way that her cry when she realizes that Ophelia is gone has, like, stuck with me for, 17 years now that I've seen this movie. It's just such a heartbreaking moment, because she believes, Ophelia's life, just ended in tragedy here, and it did. But, we're fortunate enough that we get to see the larger picture of what it was that, like, Ophelia is hopefully going home to, and also we know that, she saved her brother's life, and, now her brother will get to live a life that perhaps will, be a harsh one, being raised by, like, the guerrilla fighters and still a fascist dominated Spain, but it's a better life than he probably would have had as under his biological father. So, and Ophelia's choice mattered.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, well, we just allowed ourselves to come back around to basking in the tragedy and joy of the ending once again. Um, so yeah. Anything else that we didn't? It feels like there's probably a lot we didn't touch on, but anything major that you wanted to mention?
No, I just want to just once again talk about how this movie is really a testament to the power of myth and fairy tale storytelling, and the the craftsmanship is exquisite, the performances are exquisite, the story itself is exquisite, but ultimately it is all within the confines of, as we said, a very simple fairy tale story, but it's all the more powerful for it. Like, because these are the kinds of things that, you know, reflect upon all of our shared experiences, and we can bring so much of our own lives into it, but also, like, learn things that we perhaps hadn't considered before from stories like this, and find meaning in the inexplicable. And pretty much, I think the reason that this is my favorite movie is that everything that I love about storytelling, and specifically cinematic storytelling, is present in this movie, and I've just rarely seen a movie do it better. So I just adore it, and I've watched it countless times and will constantly be looking forward to revisiting it. It is one of my most treasured experiences, seeing this movie and getting to revisit it. So I'm very touched.
Yeah, I'm very glad we were able to do it too. Although I will say, despite my efforts to change up the structure of how we discuss this movie versus past discussions, we still managed to go 3.5 hours. So I think this is we just can't help ourselves, Jared, and.
Mhm.
And so this will just be I hope you all like our long discussions, because I don't think they'll be stopping anytime soon. But no, I just, yeah, I agree 100%. Just I love getting to revisit this film, and I was especially touched by what I mentioned earlier, that um, this seemed to elicit you know an emotional response in a different way for me, having this being the first time I've watched the film since losing my mom. And I didn't fall apart like at the parts where I thought I would have. Instead, I got emotional over the more like the more reaffirming parts and the hopeful, aspects of the story. Um, I'm really overjoyed by that because I think it's a bit of what I needed right now. And yeah. So, um, no, thank you, Stephanie. We appreciate it. Yeah, it's we had a joy revisiting this, and I'd say our first time doing one of these revisited streams was a success. We got to go back and talk about this, which opens up the floodgates um, for a lot of movies that I've talked about before on this channel, but have great desire to do so again. So so yeah, I guess that's it. We'll just start wrapping up. Next week, we're going to be talking about the film Before Sunrise. We'll be also celebrating Jared's birthday, which will be on the 30th, but we'll be celebrating on Sunday the 28th. And then the week after that, we'll be having our wrap up stream for the end of Star Wars: The Bad Batch, which again, I'm going to repeat myself. I can't believe we're at the end. Talk about getting emotional. And then in the weeks that follow, we'll be doing, kind of the details are kind of up in the air, but we will definitely be doing a anniversary stream for Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, when it hits its 25th anniversary. Wow. And, and then we'll be covering the other prequel films sort of every other week after that. So yeah. So yeah, I don't know. You don't have anything to say, Jared, before we we say goodbye?
I think we've talked long enough. I could talk for many more hours about this movie, but I think we have hopefully done it justice for the time being. And thank you all for joining us on this, because this is clearly a movie that is very important to me. I know to you as well, John, and it's an honor to be able to share it with you.
Only other thing I would say is that I'm looking forward to going out and watching some TV after we wrap up tonight, because maybe you will notice my X-Men shirt. I've been doing a rewatch actually of X-Men the animated series, basically in chunks, basically pretty much a half a season a night, because they're only like 20-minute episodes. And I've been doing that because, of course, X-Men '97 is currently running, and I figured before we get close to the end of the season on that, I actually wanted to rewatch everything, and because it's been a while. I think the last time I watched the whole series was when the DVDs came out, which were back like, I don't know, 2010, 2011, maybe. So it's been a good number of years. I know you said you haven't seen it since it was on TV, right?
Oh yeah, the original '90s series. It's
Yeah.
been years. I had mentioned that I wanted to try and revisit at least some of the episodes before watching X-Men '97. I've fallen behind on both endeavors, but I will catch up, especially if we do end up deciding to talk about the latter on this channel at some point. So.
I'm really excited because tonight I'll be taking in all 5 parts of the Phoenix Saga, which is probably my favorite part of the original series. So that'll be a lot of fun. Anyway, so yeah, just had to talk a bit about that because I was sporting the X-Men shirt. So. But yeah, no. Other than that, we'll see you guys next week for celebrating Jared's birthday and talking about the film Before Sunrise. That's the one, right?
Yep.
Okay. And Yeah, and we discussed earlier, if you haven't seen it, consider giving it a rental. I'm going to be doing as much, and looking forward to talking about that. So until next time, have a great night, everybody.
Take care. Thank you for
Bye.
joining us.